In the winter of 1348, as the Black Death ravaged through England, a football match in the village of Ashbourne ended with 7 players dead, not from the plague but from the game itself. What the surviving villagers discovered in the aftermath would reveal why medieval football during Europe's darkest hour was more terrifying than the pestilence that killed half the continent. The bodies were found scattered across 3 miles of frozen countryside, their skulls caved in by wooden clubs, their limbs twisted into impossible angles from the crushing weight of the mob that had trampled them into the mud. But it wasn't the violence that shocked the survivors who came searching for their missing sons and fathers. It was what they found clutched in the dead men's hands: fragments of clothing torn from plague victims, chunks of infected flesh that had been scraped from the makeshift ball they'd been fighting over for 2 days straight. The ball itself, when they finally located it, wedged against the door of St. Lawrence Church, wasn't made of pig's bladder like the wealthy towns used. In these desperate times, when death lurked in every shadow and normalcy had collapsed into chaos, the villagers had stuffed their playing sphere with whatever they could find: grave dirt from fresh plague burials, strips of cloth torn from the clothes of the recently deceased, hair shorn from corpses, and according to the terrified confession of the village priest, something far worse: pieces of infected flesh that the players believed would make them immune to the pestilence if they could capture the ball and hold it against their skin. What modern football fans don't understand, what has been carefully scrubbed from the sanitized history books, is that medieval football wasn't a sport. It was ritualized warfare conducted by communities facing extinction, a desperate attempt to maintain some sense of normalcy while the known world collapsed around them. And during the Black Death, when the ordinary rules of society had completely broken down, these matches became something even more sinister: death rituals disguised as games, where participants didn't just risk injury, they courted annihilation. The Ashbourne incident, recorded in the suppressed chronicles of Derby Abbey and sealed away in ecclesiastical archives for over 6 centuries, represents just one documented case of how football during the plague years became a form of mass suicide. But what the church authorities discovered when they investigated these deaths would force them to ban not just the game, but any mention of what had actually transpired during those nightmare months when football and pestilence merged into something that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. The surviving players, when questioned under threat of excommunication, revealed practices that the investigating monks initially dismissed as plague-induced madness. They spoke of intentionally playing through areas where infected corpses had been dumped, of deliberately making contact with diseased players from neighbouring villages, of using the football matches as a form of trial by ordeal, believing that those who survived the combination of extreme violence and disease exposure had been chosen by God to live through the apocalypse. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of families who had sent their infected members onto the playing field, not seeking medical treatment, but hoping that the violent physical contact might somehow drive the disease from their bodies through sheer brutality. The monastery records describe scenes of fathers dragging plague-sick sons to football matches, mothers pushing dying daughters into the scrum, entire households gathering to watch their pestilence-ridden relatives get beaten to death by strangers, believing this was a more merciful end than the lingering agony of bubonic death. What you're about to discover in the hidden archives of medieval England is why any modern person transported back to 1348 wouldn't just struggle to survive a day of plague-era football. They would face certain death from causes so numerous and horrific that the Black Death itself would seem merciful by comparison. The combination of extreme medieval violence, complete medical ignorance, social breakdown, and active disease transmission created conditions so lethal that participating in a single match carried a mortality rate higher than serving in the front lines of World War I. But the true horror lies not in the obvious dangers, but in the psychological transformation. that the plague wrought on these communities. The football matches of 1348 weren't just games played during difficult times. They were manifestations of a collective death wish. Elaborate suicide rituals performed by populations that had already given up hope of survival. The players weren't trying to win matches, they were trying to die on their own terms, in ways that felt heroic rather than helpless. The Church's attempts to suppress these practices led to some of the most violent confrontations between religious and secular authorities in medieval English history. When Bishop William de Montacute tried to physically stop a Shrove Tuesday football match in Winchester during the height of the plague, the players turned on the clergy with a ferocity that shocked even hardened medieval observers. The bishop's personal guards were overwhelmed by a mob of plague-maddened footballers who had been playing continuously for 4 days without food or rest, their bodies already beginning to show the black swellings that marked the early stages of bubonic infection. What happened next was carefully omitted from official church records, but fragments survive in the private letters of monks who witnessed the incident. The players didn't just attack the bishop's men, they forced them to participate in the match. Stripped of their armour and thrown into the brutal scrum, the guards found themselves caught in a game where the rules had long since been abandoned, and survival depended not on skill or strategy, but on the willingness to inflict and endure unimaginable violence. The match continued for another 6 hours after the bishop's intervention, by which time 3 of his guards were dead and 2 others had suffered injuries so severe that they would die within days. But it was the psychological impact, the survivors, that truly revealed the horror of what medieval football had become during the plague years. The guards who lived through the experience were never the same. They spoke of a form of combat more savage than anything they had encountered in warfare, of men fighting with the desperation of the condemned, of violence so extreme that it seemed to transcend human limitations. This is the reality of football during the Black Death that has been hidden from modern audiences. Not a charming medieval tradition that evolved into our modern game, but a manifestation of collective trauma so severe that it created new forms of human behaviour. The players of 1348 weren't ancestors of today's footballers. They were members of a dying civilization, engaging in practices so extreme that they would be classified as crimes against humanity by modern standards. The documents that survive, scattered across monastery archives and private collections throughout Europe, paint a picture of football during the plague years that challenges everything we think we know about both medieval sports and human nature under extreme stress. These weren't games being played by people facing difficult times. They were death rituals being performed by communities that had already crossed the line from civilization into something darker. The medieval football nightmare. To understand why football during the Black Death was so uniquely lethal, you first need to comprehend just how savage the game had already become before the plague arrived. Medieval football wasn't a sport as we understand the concept today. It was organized chaos that regularly resulted in deaths, serious injuries, and property destruction, on a scale that prompted repeated attempts at legal suppression by both royal and ecclesiastical authorities. The earliest documented football match in England, recorded in the chronicles of William Fitz-Stephen in 1174, already contained elements that would horrify modern observers. Fitz-Stephen described crowds of several hundred young men gathering in fields outside London, divided into 2 groups representing different neighbourhoods or trades, engaging in what he termed a violent and bloody combat over possession of a ball made from a pig's bladder. Even in this earliest account, the chronicler noted that injuries were expected and accepted as part of the entertainment. By the 14th century, football had evolved into something even more brutal. The Shrove Tuesday traditions that had developed in towns like Ashbourne, Chester-le-Street, and Workington created annual spectacles that bore more resemblance to warfare than recreation. These weren't friendly competitions between neighbouring communities. They were ritualized conflicts that allowed ancient grievances to be settled through sanctioned violence. The rules, such as they existed, were designed to maximize chaos rather than create fair competition. In most traditional games, the goals were placed several miles apart, often on opposite sides of entire towns or villages. The Ashbourne Royal Shrovetide football, which continues in modified form today, originally featured goals placed 3 miles apart, with the River Henmore running directly through the middle of the playing field. During winter matches, when the river was at its highest and coldest, drowning was not just a possibility, but an expected outcome. Contemporary accounts from the 14th century describe matches that lasted for days, with players sleeping in the field and resuming play at dawn. The 30-21 match between the villages of Middleton and Kenton, recorded in the manor rolls of the Earl of Lancaster, lasted for 4 consecutive days and resulted in what the clerk described as numerous injuries of a grievous nature and destruction of property valued at more than £20, a sum equivalent to several years' wages for a common labourer. The violence wasn't incidental to the game, it was the primary attraction. Players routinely armed themselves with wooden clubs, stones wrapped in cloth, and what contemporary sources euphemistically called implements of encouragement. The 1314 proclamation by Edward II banning football in London specifically mentioned the use of staves and stones and other weapons as integral parts of the game, suggesting that armed combat was not just tolerated, but expected. Court records from the reign of Edward II reveal the systematic nature of football violence. The coroner's rolls for Middlesex County between 130 and 20 document at least 15 deaths directly attributed to football matches, and these represent only cases where formal inquests were conducted. Many deaths, particularly in rural areas where central authority was weak, went unrecorded or were attributed to other causes to avoid legal complications. The case of Henry Dale, recorded in the London coroner's rolls for 1321, provides a typical example of football fatality. During this period, Henry was participating in a Shrove Tuesday match in the fields outside London when he was struck in the head with a wooden club wielded by a player from a rival guild. According to witness testimony, Henry had been attempting to retrieve the ball from a drainage ditch when he was attacked by several opponents who had been waiting in ambush. The blow fractured his skull, but rather than stopping the match to provide assistance, the other players continued playing around Henry's unconscious body for several hours before anyone thought to summon help. By the time a physician arrived, Henry had been trampled by dozens of players and was beyond medical assistance. The coroner's verdict was death by misadventure, a finding that protected the other players from murder charges, but acknowledged that Henry's death was a direct result of the extreme violence that characterized medieval football. The case prompted renewed calls for football bans, but enforcement was sporadic and ineffective. The physical demands of medieval football were unlike anything in modern sports. Matches typically involved hundreds of players on each side, with no substitutions allowed and no time limits imposed. Players were expected to continue fighting regardless of injury, exhaustion or weather conditions. The winter matches were particularly brutal, as frozen ground increased the severity of falls, while cold temperatures made hypothermia a constant threat for players who became separated from the main group or fell unconscious during play. Medical treatment, when available at all, was primitive and often more dangerous than the injuries themselves. The standard treatment for head trauma was trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits. Broken bones were set without anesthesia and immobilized with whatever materials were available, often resulting in permanent disability or fatal infections. Open wounds were treated with applications of boiling oil, based on the medical theory that heat would drive out corruption, a practice that killed more patients than it cured. The social dynamics of medieval football created additional layers of danger. Matches often served as proxies for conflicts between different social classes, trades, or communities. The annual football match between apprentices and journeymen in London regularly devolved into broader social riots that required military intervention to suppress. The 37-27 match between butchers and bakers, recorded in the Chronicles of London, resulted in 3 days of street fighting that left large sections of the city under martial law. Geographic factors made medieval football even more perilous. Unlike modern stadiums with controlled environments, medieval matches were played across natural terrain that included rivers, forests, swamps, and rocky hills. The traditional Shrovetide match in Derby took place in and around the River Derwent, which players were expected to cross multiple times during the course of play. Drowning deaths were so common that local authorities stationed boats along the river, though rescue attempts were often unsuccessful due to the weight of medieval clothing and the hypothermic effects of winter water. The ball itself presented unique dangers in medieval football. Unlike modern balls designed for safety and consistency, medieval footballs were crude affairs stuffed with whatever materials were available. During times of scarcity, balls might be filled with sawdust, rags, or even stones to achieve the proper weight. The irregular shape and unpredictable bounce of these primitive balls made catching and carrying extremely difficult, leading to desperate scrambles that often resulted in pile-ups involving dozens of players. Weapons used in medieval football was not just tolerated, but encouraged. The Winchester Chronicle describes the annual football match between rival parishes as featuring clubs and staves for the proper prosecution of the game. Players routinely concealed knives, brass knuckles, and weighted leather gloves that could deliver devastating blows. The ecclesiastical authorities' repeated condemnations of football specifically mentioned these weapons, suggesting that their use was widespread and systematic. The absence of referees or any form of official oversight meant that disputes during play were settled through immediate violence. Unlike modern sports, where officials can stop play to resolve conflicts, medieval football matches continued regardless of what was happening among individual players. A player who felt wronged by an opponent's actions had no recourse except personal retaliation, often leading to extended fights within the larger game that could last for hours and involve dozens of participants. Terrain-based hazards added another layer of mortality to medieval football. Matches were played across whatever landscape existed between the designated goals, including forests, where players could be impaled on broken branches, swamps, where they could become trapped in mud or quicksand, and cliff areas where falls could prove fatal. The traditional football ground at Chesterley Street included a section of Roman ruins with exposed stonework and partially collapsed walls that created numerous opportunities for serious injury. The psychological aspects of medieval football created conditions that pushed participants beyond normal human limitations. The combination of extreme physical exertion, crowd pressure, and the cultural expectation of martial prowess led players to continue fighting long after they should have sought medical attention. Contemporary accounts describe players continuing to participate with broken bones, severe lacerations, and obvious head trauma, driven by social pressures that made withdrawal from the match equivalent to public humiliation. The scale of medieval football matches created stampede conditions that would be recognized today as inherently lethal, with hundreds of players concentrated in relatively small areas, fighting for possession of a single ball. Crowd dynamics took over that were beyond the control of any individual participant. Players who fell during these massive scrums faced almost certain death from trampling, as the weight and momentum of the crowd made it impossible for those above to avoid stepping on fallen players even if they wanted to. Weather conditions during traditional football seasons added environmental hazards that modern players never face. Shrove Tuesday falls during winter months when temperatures are at their lowest and daylight hours are limited. Matches that continued after dark were played by firelight, creating additional hazards from open flames and smoke that could obscure vision and create confusion about player positions and field boundaries. The lack of protective equipment in medieval football meant that every contact carried the potential for serious injury. Players wore their ordinary clothes, heavy wool tunics, leather boots, and cloth caps that provided no protection against impact. The absence of padding, helmets, or any form of protective gear meant that routine collisions could result in broken bones, concussions, or internal injuries that would be fatal without proper medical treatment. Perhaps most troubling was the social acceptance of extreme violence in medieval football. Unlike modern sports, where serious injuries prompt calls for rule changes and safety improvements, medieval society viewed football casualties as inevitable and even desirable proof of masculine virtue. Players who died during matches were often celebrated as heroes who had demonstrated their courage and commitment to their community, creating cultural incentives for increasingly reckless behaviour. By 3048, when the Black Death reached England, medieval football had already evolved into one of the most dangerous activities in civilian life. The annual death toll from football matches was accepted as normal, and the extreme violence was considered an essential part of the game's appeal. Communities that had grown accustomed to multiple deaths during their traditional football seasons were psychologically prepared for the additional mortality that would come when pestilence was added to the already lethal mix of organized violence and medical ignorance. The stage was set for a perfect storm of human destruction. Medieval football provided the violent framework. Social breakdown removed what few restraints existed, and the Black Death would transform an already deadly game into something that transcended sport entirely and became a form of ritualized mass suicide. The Black Death arrives. The plague that would forever change the nature of medieval football arrived in England during the autumn of 1348, but its journey across Europe had already provided terrifying previews of what happened when pestilence encountered the violent world of medieval sports. The first documented case of plague affecting a football match occurred in the port city of Messina in October 1347, when Genoese traders brought both the disease and their traditional ball games to the Sicilian trading hub. According to the suppressed chronicles of Brother Giacomo de Messina, a Franciscan monk, whose account was later seized by church authorities, the Genoese merchants organized a football match to celebrate their successful trading voyage. The game was played in the traditional manner, with teams representing different trading companies competing for possession of a leather ball on a field that stretched from the harbour to the city's main square. What the participants didn't realize was that several of the Genoese players were already in the early stages of bubonic infection. The match lasted 6 hours and involved over 200 participants. By the contemporary standards of medieval football, it was considered a great success. Only 3 players died during the game itself, all from conventional injuries rather than disease. But within 2 weeks, 47 of the participants had developed the characteristic swellings and black patches that marked bubonic plague. The disease spread so rapidly through the community that by Christmas 1347, nearly half of Messina's population was dead. Brother Giacomo's account, preserved in fragments discovered in the Vatican secret archives during the 20th century, described the psychological impact of watching plague spread through a community that had shared the intimate physical contact of medieval football. Players who had wrestled and fought together on the field found themselves watching their former opponents die in agony, their bodies covered with the black boils that gave the plague its popular name. The social bonds that normally connected participants in community football matches were replaced by terror and suspicion as survivors realized that their sporting celebration had become a vector for mass death. The Messina incident established a pattern that would be repeated across Europe as the plague spread northward through traditional trading routes. Communities that maintained traditional football festivals found themselves particularly vulnerable to rapid disease transmission, while the extreme physical contact required by medieval football accelerated the progression from initial infection to fatal illness. By the summer of 1348, the plague had reached the French coast, and with it came the first reports of what chroniclers began calling death matches. Football games played in communities that were actively experiencing plague outbreaks. The Abbey of Saint-Denis recorded an incident in June 1348, where the village of Pontoise attempted to maintain its traditional midsummer football festival despite losing over a third of its population to plague in the preceding months. The Pontoise match was played using a ball stuffed with straw taken from the beds of plague victims, based on the folk belief that exposure to infected materials might provide immunity through gradual exposure. The game lasted only 3 hours before it was abandoned when 7 players collapsed on the field, not from injuries but from the rapid onset of pneumonic plague symptoms. According to the Abbey records, all 43 participants in the match were dead within 10 days. More disturbing than the rapid mortality was the behaviour of the players during the match itself. Witnesses described men fighting with a desperation that went beyond normal competitive spirit, as though they were engaged in a final battle against death itself. Players continued to participate even after developing obvious plague symptoms, fever, delirium, and the characteristic swellings, driven by a collective madness that the Abbey chronicler attributed to divine punishment for their refusal to abandon worldly pleasures during humanity's final judgment. The psychological impact of the plague created new forms of football behaviour that defied rational explanation. In the Norman town of Coutances, the traditional Assumption Day football match in August 1348 was modified to include deliberate contact with plague victims. Healthy players would visit the pest houses where the dying were isolated, touch the infected individuals, and then return to the match, believing that they had acquired supernatural protection. The result was predictable. The entire team died within a fortnight, but the practice spread to other communities facing similar plague pressures. When the Black Death crossed the English Channel in September 1348, it found a population already psychologically prepared for catastrophe by decades of war, famine, and social upheaval. The traditional football communities of southern England responded to the plague's arrival not by abandoning their dangerous customs, but by incorporating disease into their existing frameworks of ritualized violence. The first English football match played during active plague conditions took place in the port town of Weymouth in early October. The local Michaelmas football tradition had been scheduled for September 29th, but the match was delayed when several potential participants developed plague symptoms. Rather than cancelling the event, the community decided to proceed with what they called a plague match, a football game played specifically by individuals who were already infected or suspected of infection. The Weymouth plague match was organised by Father William de Montfort, the local parish priest, who had developed his own theological interpretation of the pestilence. According to fragments of his sermons preserved in the Dorset County records, Father William believed that the plague was God's test of human courage, and that those who faced death without fear would be granted eternal salvation. He encouraged infected parishioners to participate in the football match as a form of spiritual trial by ordeal. The match itself was a grotesque parody of traditional football. Players who were too weak from illness to run would be carried to the ball by healthier participants. Those experiencing the delirium that accompanied advanced plague symptoms would fight with supernatural intensity, displaying strength that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. The game continued until all but 3 participants had collapsed from exhaustion or advancing illness. Father William's experiment in plague football was considered such a success by the surviving community that it was repeated weekly throughout the autumn. Of each successive match drew fewer participants as the pool of healthy players was depleted, but the intensity of play increased as communities facing extinction invested their final energies in increasingly desperate displays of defiance against death. The practice spread rapidly along the English coast as trading vessels carried both plague and news of the Weymouth matches to other ports. By November 1348, plague football had become established in Dover, Hastings, and Portsmouth, with each community developing its own variations on the basic concept of using traditional games as venues for confronting mortality. The Dover version of plague football incorporated elements of the town's military culture, with matches organised as mock battles between teams representing different military units. Players wore whatever armour they could obtain, and used weapons openly rather than concealing them as was traditional in civilian football. The combination of plague symptoms, medieval weapons, and military tactics created carnage that exceeded anything previously seen in English sport. The Hastings plague matches took a different approach, incorporating religious elements that reflected the community's desperate attempts to understand divine purpose in their suffering. Matches were played in the town cemetery, with goals positioned at opposite ends of the burial ground. Players were required to touch fresh graves before handling the ball, and the match was considered won when one team successfully carried the ball to the altar of the town church. Portsmouth developed perhaps the most extreme version of plague football, with matches played entirely in the harbour during high tide. Players were required to maintain possession of the ball while swimming or treading water, with drowning considered as acceptable a form of death as plague or violence. The Portsmouth harbour matches typically lasted until all participants were dead, with survivors from the community recovering the bodies and the ball during low tide. The inland progression of plague football followed the major river systems and trading routes that connected coastal ports to market towns throughout southern England. The Thames corridor proved particularly effective at spreading both disease and the new sporting practices, with communities like Reading, Oxford and Wallingford each developing their own interpretations of how traditional football could be modified to incorporate plague conditions. The Reading plague matches introduced the practice of using infected corpses as footballs themselves. When leather balls became scarce due to disrupted trade and the death of craftsmen, the community began using bodies of recent plague victims, wrapped in cloth and bound with rope. The practice was justified through a theological interpretation that claimed the dead could achieve salvation through continued participation in community activities, even after their physical death. Oxford, with its concentration of educated clergy, developed a more sophisticated approach to plague football that incorporated elements of medieval medical theory. Matches were organised according to the dominant humoral theories of disease, with players assigned to teams based on their supposed physical temperament. The university physicians believed that the extreme physical exertion of football might help expel corrupted humours from the body, potentially curing plague through violent exercise. The Oxford medical approach to plague football created detailed records that provide unique insights into how medieval communities understood the relationship between disease and physical activity. Roger de Nottingham, one of the university physicians who supervised these experimental matches, maintained careful notes on player symptoms, match duration, and outcomes. His records, discovered in the Bodleian Library archives during the 19th century, but subsequently restricted from public access, document systematic attempts to cure plague through increasingly extreme football exercises. Dr. Rogers' notes describe matches that lasted for days, with players encouraged to continue participating, even as they developed advanced plague symptoms. The physician believed that the violent physical contact of football might help burst the bubonic swellings that characterize the disease, releasing the corrupted matter and allowing the body to heal naturally. The results were universally fatal, but Roger interpreted each death as proof that his patients had been too weakened by sin to benefit from his innovative treatment. The psychological transformation of English society during the plague's initial months created conditions that made these extreme sporting practices seem rational to communities facing extinction. Traditional social structures had collapsed. Religious authorities offered conflicting explanations for the catastrophe, and medical knowledge proved completely inadequate to address the crisis. In this context, football, already a violent and dangerous activity, became a venue for communities to exert some control over their circumstances through ritualized defiance of death. The winter of 1348-1349 marked the peak of plague football activities in England, with traditional agricultural work suspended due to massive population losses and normal social festivities cancelled due to religious prohibitions. Football matches became one of the few community activities that continued despite the catastrophe. The combination of winter weather, active plague transmission, and the extreme violence of medieval football created mortality rates that exceeded those of active warfare. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe what they witnessed during these winter plague matches. Brother Thomas of Waltham, writing in his suppressed chronicle De Pest et Ludis Mortis, of plague and death games, described football matches where more players died during play than survived to see the conclusion. His account of the Christmas Day match in his own community of Waltham Abbey provides a representative example of how completely plague had transformed traditional sporting activities. The Waltham Christmas match began before dawn on December 25th, 1348, with teams representing the Abbey's secular workers and the surrounding farming community. By this point, both groups had been devastated by plague, with fewer than 30 men available to participate in what had traditionally been a match involving hundreds of players. The reduced numbers meant that the game was played with an intensity that exceeded normal competitive spirit, as each player carried the weight of representing his entire community. Brother Thomas's chronicle describes a match that bore little resemblance to traditional football. Players who collapsed from plague symptoms during play were simply incorporated into the field conditions, with active players required to climb over or run around bodies that might be unconscious, dying or already dead. The ball itself had been stuffed with clothing taken from recent plague victims, based on the belief that handling infected materials might provide spiritual protection through divine trial. The match continued for 9 hours, with players taking breaks only to vomit or deal with the dysentery that accompanied advanced plague symptoms. As darkness fell, the game was illuminated by torches held by plague-sick women and children who were too weak to participate, but still wanted to witness what many believed would be their community's final celebration. Brother Thomas recorded that the match ended when the last surviving player, a young farmer named Geoffrey Atwell, collapsed while attempting to carry the ball to the abbey gates. Geoffrey had been playing continuously for the entire 9 hours despite obvious plague symptoms, driven by the belief that completing the match might somehow save his community from total extinction. He died clutching the infected ball, and his body was left in the field until spring, because the few survivors lacked the strength to dig graves in the frozen ground. The Waltham Christmas match represented not just the extreme evolution of plague football, but the complete breakdown of medieval English society under the pressure of unprecedented mortality. Communities that had maintained their social cohesion through centuries of warfare, famine, and political upheaval found themselves unable to cope with the simultaneous collapse of population, authority, and meaning that accompanied the Black Death. By the spring of 1349, the practice of plague football had spread throughout most of England, but the pool of potential participants had been so depleted that most communities could no longer organise matches. The few attempts that were made typically involved children and elderly individuals who had somehow survived the initial plague waves. But these games bore little resemblance to the massive community celebrations that had characterized traditional medieval football. The end of the plague football era came not through official prohibition or gradual abandonment, but through simple lack of participants. Communities that had invested their final energies in increasingly desperate sporting rituals found themselves without enough survivors to maintain any form of organised activity. The traditional football grounds of England became graveyards, and the skills required to organise and play medieval football died along with the communities that had preserved them. What survived were the traumatic memories of those few individuals who lived through both the plague and the extreme sporting practices it had spawned. These survivors carried with them psychological scars that would influence English sporting culture for generations, creating a subconscious association between competitive games and mass death that would never be entirely overcome. The Black Death had not simply killed individuals, it had destroyed the social frameworks that made traditional community activities possible. The football that eventually re-emerged in England would be a fundamentally different activity, stripped of the massive community participation and extreme violence that had characterized the medieval game. The plague had not just changed who played football, it had changed what football was, and could be. But during those nightmare months of 1348 and 1349, when the old world was dying and the new one had not yet been born, football became something unprecedented in human history, a form of community ritual that consciously courted extinction. The players of plague football were not trying to win games, they were trying to die with dignity in a world that no longer offered any other form of meaningful choice. Why you'd die from the game itself. Even without the plague adding its deadly complications, medieval football, during the 14th century, represented one of the most consistently lethal activities in civilian life. The violence was not incidental to the game, it was the primary attraction, and it was conducted with weapons, tactics, and a level of brutality that would horrify modern observers. Any contemporary person transported back to participate in a single match would face death from multiple causes that had nothing to do with disease. The basic structure of medieval football created conditions that guaranteed serious injuries and frequent deaths, unlike modern sports played on controlled surfaces with clearly defined boundaries. Medieval matches took place across miles of natural terrain that included every geographic hazard the local landscape could provide. The traditional Shrovetide football match in Derby, for example, was played from the marketplace to goals located at Nunsmore and Greenhill, a distance of approximately 2 miles through the centre of the town, across the River Derwent, and over terrain that included cobblestone streets, muddy fields, rocky hills, and dense woodland. The River Derwent crossing alone was responsible for multiple deaths every year. The river was deepest and most dangerous during late winter, when the traditional matches were held, with fast-moving current and water temperatures that could induce fatal hypothermia within minutes. Players were expected to cross the river while maintaining possession of the ball and fighting off opponents, a combination that made drowning almost inevitable for anyone who lost their footing or became separated from the main group. The documented drowning of William de Ludlow during the 1337 Derby match provides a typical example of water-related football mortality. According to the coroner's inquest, William had successfully carried the ball across the river, but was attacked by opposing players while climbing the muddy bank on the far side. The combined weight of William and his attackers caused the bank to collapse, sending all 4 men back into the freezing water. William's heavy wool clothing absorbed water and dragged him under before he could surface, while his attackers, unencumbered by ball possession, were able to swim to safety. The coroner noted that William's body was not recovered until 3 days after the match ended, when it was found wedged against a mill wheel nearly a mile downstream. More disturbing than the drowning itself was the coroner's observation that the other players had continued the match without interruption, apparently viewing William's death as simply another obstacle to be played around, rather than a reason to stop the game. Medieval football weapons created injury patterns that would be instantly fatal without modern medical intervention. Players routinely carried clubs, made from seasoned hardwood, often weighted with iron or lead to increase their striking power. These weapons were not just carried for intimidation. They were used actively throughout the match, to disable opponents, clear paths through crowds, and maintain possession of the ball through systematic violence. The case of Robert Lee Smith, documented in the Northumberland County Records for 1342, illustrates the lethal effectiveness of football weaponry. Robert was participating in a traditional New Year's match between the villages of Hexham and Corbridge when he was struck in the head by an opponent wielding a hash club reinforced with iron bands. The blow fractured Robert's skull in multiple places and drove bone fragments into his brain tissue. According to witness testimony, Robert remained conscious for several minutes after the impact, during which time he continued attempting to play football while blood poured from his head wound. Other players, apparently accustomed to seeing serious injuries during matches, helped Robert to his feet and encouraged him to continue participating. Robert managed to advance the ball nearly 50 yards before collapsing into a coma from which he never recovered. The medical treatment Robert received was typical of 14th century practice, and arguably more dangerous than the original injury. The local barber surgeon attempted to relieve pressure on Robert's brain by drilling holes in his skull using a carpenter's auger, a procedure performed without anesthesia or antiseptic precautions. The surgeon's tools were not medical instruments, but repurposed metalworking equipment that had been used for shoeing horses earlier the same day. The trepanation procedure lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Robert regained consciousness multiple times and attempted to resume playing football despite being physically restrained by several assistants. The surgeon interpreted Robert's continued obsession with football as evidence that evil spirits associated with the game had possessed his patient's mind, and attempted to cure this condition by pouring boiling wine into the holes he had drilled in Robert's skull. Robert died during this treatment, but his death was recorded as resulting from the original football injury rather than the medical intervention. The player who had struck Robert with the club was never prosecuted, as weapon use during football matches was considered normal and legally acceptable. The incident prompted no changes to local football customs and was quickly forgotten, except as an example of the warrior spirit that the community expected from its football players. Stone throwing was another common football tactic that created injury patterns modern medicine would struggle to address. Players routinely collected rocks and wrapped them in cloth to create projectiles that could disable opponents at range or break up formations around the ball. The use of thrown stones was so common that many traditional football fields were deliberately chosen for their abundant supply of suitable throwing rocks. The death of Alice de Wendover during a 3044 football match in Buckinghamshire demonstrates how stone throwing created fatal injuries that extended beyond the players themselves. Alice was not participating in the match, but was working in a field adjacent to the football ground when she was struck in the head by a stone thrown by a player attempting to disrupt an opponent's advance. The force of impact was sufficient to crush Alice's skull and kill her instantly. The coroner's investigation revealed that Alice was the third non-participant killed by football stone throwing in Buckinghamshire during the previous 5 years. Despite this pattern of civilian casualties, no legal restrictions were placed on stone use during football matches. The coroner's verdict ruled Alice's death accidental, and her family received no compensation for their loss. The psychological effects of extreme football violence created behavioural patterns that ensured maximum injury rates even when players had opportunities to avoid harm. Medieval football culture celebrated players who continued fighting despite serious injuries, creating social pressures that prevented rational responses to trauma. Players who withdrew from matches due to injury faced community shame that could last for years, while those who died during play were honoured as heroes who had demonstrated ultimate commitment to their community. This psychological conditioning created situations where players would continue participating with injuries that were obviously life-threatening. The Chronicle of Melrose Abbey records a 3046 football match where a player named Duncan McAlpin continued fighting for over an hour after suffering a compound fracture that left his shin bone protruding through his skin. Duncan's teammates encouraged him to continue playing, viewing his perseverance as inspirational rather than medically dangerous. Duncan eventually collapsed from blood loss and shock, but even then he refused to be carried from the field until the match was completed. He died during the night following the game, but his final hours were spent recounting highlights of the match to visitors who came to praise his heroic performance. The community erected a stone marker in Duncan's honour, and his behaviour was held up as an example for future generations of football players. The lack of medical knowledge in medieval communities meant that even minor football injuries often progressed to fatal complications. Simple cuts and bruises regularly became infected due to the complete absence of antiseptic practices, while broken bones frequently healed incorrectly or not at all, leading to permanent disability or death from gangrene and blood poisoning. The treatment of open wounds during medieval football matches involved practices that would be recognized today as virtually guaranteeing fatal infections. Wounds were commonly treated with applications of animal dung, based on the theory that the heat generated by decomposition would drive out evil spirits. More severe injuries might be treated with red-hot iron bars applied directly to the wound, a practice that caused additional tissue damage while doing nothing to prevent infection. The documented case of Henry Carpenter, injured during a 1349 football match in Essex, provides a typical example of how medieval medical treatment converted survivable injuries into death sentences. Henry suffered a deep laceration on his thigh when he was struck by an opponent's knife during a struggle for ball possession. The wound was approximately 6 inches long, but had missed major blood vessels and would have been easily treatable with modern surgical techniques. The local wise woman who treated Henry's injury used methods that were considered advanced for the time period. She cleaned the wound with vinegar, applied a poultice made from breadcrumbs and spiderwebs, and bound the injury with strips of cloth that had been boiled in wine. These treatments were more sophisticated than the animal dung applications commonly used for football injuries, yet they still introduced multiple sources of bacterial infection into Henry's wound. Henry's injury became infected within 3 days, developing the characteristic red streaking that indicated blood poisoning. The wise woman attempted to treat the infection by applying heated copper coins to Henry's skin and forcing him to drink a mixture of ground pearls and holy water. When these treatments failed to improve his condition, she concluded that Henry had been cursed by opponents who had used supernatural means during the football match. The treatment for supernatural curse involved practices that accelerated Henry's decline toward death. He was buried up to his neck in fresh horse manure for 3 days, based on the theory that the earth's purifying power could draw out evil influences. When this treatment failed to cure his infection, Henry was subjected to a series of increasingly extreme spiritual interventions that included being beaten with blessed branches and forced to consume his own infected pus, mixed with wine. Henry died after 2 weeks of steadily worsening condition, during which time his original football injury had developed into systemic sepsis that shut down his major organ systems. His death was attributed to supernatural causes rather than medical complications, and the wise woman who had treated him received payment from Henry's family for her efforts to combat evil magic. The incident prompted no changes to football safety practices or medical treatment protocols. The extreme physical demands of medieval football created cardiovascular stress that would prove fatal to any modern person lacking the lifetime conditioning that characterized 14th century populations. Medieval football matches often lasted for days, with players expected to fight continuously without rest, food, or water breaks. The combination of extreme physical exertion, dehydration, and exposure to harsh weather conditions created perfect conditions for heart failure, heat stroke, and exhaustion-related death. The physical conditioning of medieval populations was adapted to constant low-level physical stress, but not to the extreme demands of sustained combat that characterized football matches. Even players who had spent their lives performing hard physical labor found themselves unprepared for the intensity and duration of major football matches. Contemporary accounts describe players collapsing from exhaustion after only a few hours of play, despite being considered strong and healthy by their communities. The death of Thomas Brewster during the 1347 Carlisle football match demonstrates how extreme physical demands killed even experienced players. Thomas was a blacksmith known throughout the region for his exceptional strength and endurance, but he collapsed during the second day of a traditional Easter match after fighting continuously for over 18 hours. Witnesses described Thomas as sweating profusely, despite cold weather and complaining of chest pains, before he suddenly fell unconscious and never revived. The medieval understanding of exercise physiology was so primitive that Thomas's death was attributed to spiritual weakness rather than physical overexertion. His collapse was interpreted as evidence that he had not prayed sufficiently before the match, or had committed unconfessed sins that made him unworthy of victory. This theological interpretation prevented any recognition that the physical demands of the match had exceeded human capabilities, and ensured that future matches would continue to impose similar deadly stresses on participants. The equipment used in medieval football was specifically designed to maximize injury potential, rather than provide protection or fair competition. The balls themselves were irregular in shape and unpredictable in movement, making catching and carrying extremely difficult and leading to desperate scrambles that often resulted in pile-ups involving dozens of players. The weight and hardness of medieval footballs meant that being struck by a thrown or kicked ball could cause serious injuries, including broken bones, internal bleeding, and concussions. Medieval footballs were constructed using techniques that prioritized durability over safety. The outer covering was typically made from thick leather, taken from cattle or pigs, sewn together with heavy thread that created raised seams and irregular surfaces. The interior was stuffed with whatever materials were available, including straw, sawdust, cloth scraps, and sometimes stones or sand, to achieve the desired weight. The irregular construction of medieval footballs created unpredictable bounce and flight patterns that made normal defensive reactions inadequate. Players could not anticipate where a kicked ball would land or how it would bounce, leading to situations where multiple players would converge on the same location simultaneously and collide with potentially fatal force. The hard leather construction meant that being struck by a medieval football was equivalent to being hit by a rock of similar size and weight. The case of Peter de Blackburn, killed during a 30-45 football match in Lancashire, illustrates the lethal potential of medieval football equipment. Peter was running toward the ball when it struck him directly in the chest after an opponent's kick. The impact was sufficient to stop Peter's heart and kill him instantly, according to witnesses who described him falling to the ground as though struck by lightning. The post-mortem examination of Peter's body revealed extensive internal injuries, including broken ribs and massive internal bleeding, caused by the force of the football impact. The leather ball had been stuffed with a mixture of straw and small stones, giving it enough weight to cause devastating injuries upon impact. The player who had kicked the ball was considered to have made a skillful play rather than committed an assault, and no legal action was taken in response to Peter's death. The clothing worn during medieval football matches provided no protection against injury, while creating additional hazards that could prove fatal. Players wore their ordinary work clothes, which were typically made from heavy wool, that became waterlogged in wet conditions and restricted movement when saturated. The long tunics and loose sleeves that characterized medieval fashion created opportunities for opponents to grab and control players through their clothing, leading to situations where players could be strangled or trampled because they were unable to break free from restraining garments. Medieval boots were constructed with heavy leather soles and metal reinforcements that made them effective weapons when used to kick or stomp opponents. The pointed toes that were fashionable during the 14th century could inflict puncture wounds that penetrated deeply into body tissue, while the metal heel plates could crush bones or cause concussions when used as striking weapons. The death of William de Ashby during a 3048 football match in Lincolnshire demonstrates how medieval clothing and footwear contributed to football fatalities. William became entangled with an opponent during a struggle for the ball, and his long tunic became twisted around the other player's arms. When both men fell to the ground, William's tunic tightened around his neck like a noose, strangling him while his opponent was unable to provide assistance due to his own entanglement in the fabric. Witnesses attempted to cut William free using knives, but the heavy wool fabric was too thick to cut quickly, and William had already lost consciousness by the time they succeeded in freeing his neck. He never regained consciousness and died within minutes of being freed from his own clothing. The incident was ruled accidental, and no changes were made to football dress codes or safety practices. The competitive dynamics of medieval football created escalating cycles of violence that ensured maximum injury rates throughout each match. Unlike modern sports where officials can intervene to control dangerous play, medieval football had no referees or external authority to moderate player behaviour. Disputes were settled through immediate violence, and any perceived unfairness or injury could trigger extended conflicts that involved dozens of players and lasted for hours. The absence of rules beyond the basic objective of moving the ball to a designated goal meant that any tactic was considered acceptable, as long as it contributed to victory. Players regularly used tactics that would be considered attempted murder in any other context, including deliberately trampling fallen opponents, striking unconscious players with weapons, and coordinating group attacks on individual enemies. The 3046 football match between Kendal and Windermere in Westmoreland provides a documented example of how competitive escalation led to systematic violence that exceeded the boundaries of sport. The match began as a traditional celebration, but devolved into organised warfare when a dispute arose over whether a particular play had achieved a legitimate goal. Instead of accepting the decision of community elders, both teams armed themselves with agricultural tools and began fighting with the apparent intention of killing as many opponents as possible. The violence continued for 6 hours and involved not just the original football players, but most of the adult male population of both communities. By the time exhaustion forced an end to the fighting, 11 men were dead and dozens more were seriously injured. The original football had been forgotten entirely, and the conflict had become a general war between the two communities that required intervention by the sheriff of Westmoreland to prevent further escalation. The Kendal-Windermere incident was not unique. Similar escalations were documented throughout northern England during the 14th century, suggesting that the competitive pressures of medieval football regularly transformed sporting events into actual warfare. These incidents were typically resolved through legal settlements rather than prosecutions, indicating that extreme violence during football matches was considered regrettable but not criminal. The combination of extreme violence, primitive medical care, dangerous equipment, and deadly playing conditions meant that medieval football had evolved into an activity with mortality rates comparable to military combat. Any modern person forced to participate in a 14th century football match would face immediate death from causes that the medieval participants had learned to accept as normal hazards of their favourite entertainment. But the physical dangers of the game itself were only the beginning of the threats facing anyone unfortunate enough to play football during the Black Death. When plague was added to this already lethal mix, the mortality rate rose from dangerous to essentially certain, and the nature of the deaths became far more horrible than simple sporting casualties. Why the plague made everything worse. The arrival of the Black Death in England during the autumn of 1348 transformed medieval football from an extremely dangerous sport into a form of community suicide. The plague didn't simply add disease transmission to the existing risks of extreme violence. It fundamentally altered the psychological, social, and medical environment in ways that made every aspect of football exponentially more lethal. The most obvious plague-related danger came from the disease transmission that occurred during the intense physical contact required by medieval football. Players engaged in sustained wrestling, grappling, and close combat that involved sharing bodily fluids through cuts, saliva, and respiratory droplets. The pneumonic form of plague, which attacked the lungs and was transmitted through airborne particles, spread with devastating efficiency among players who spent hours in close proximity, breathing heavily from extreme exertion. The medical understanding of disease transmission in 14th century England was so primitive that communities actively engaged in practices that maximized plague spread during football matches. The dominant theory of disease causation involved corrupted air and imbalanced bodily humours, leading to treatments that included deliberate exposure to infected materials and bloodletting procedures that weakened players' natural resistance to infection. The case of the Shrewsbury Candlemas football match in February 1349 provides a documented example of how medieval medical ignorance accelerated plague transmission during sporting events. The match was organised by Brother Benedict of Shrewsbury Abbey, who believed that vigorous physical exercise would help expel corrupted humours from participants' bodies and provide protection against plague infection. Brother Benedict's medical theory led him to encourage infected players to participate in the match, reasoning that the violent physical contact would help burst plague bubbles and release the corrupted matter that caused illness. Players were instructed to deliberately target the swollen lymph nodes that characterized bubonic plague, believing that rupturing these buboes through blunt force trauma would cure the disease. The Shrewsbury match began with 14 participants, 7 of whom were already showing early plague symptoms, including fever, weakness, and small bubonic swellings. Brother Benedict supervised the proceedings personally, using a wooden staff to direct players toward infected opponents, and encouraging more aggressive physical contact when he believed medical benefits were being achieved. The match lasted only 4 hours before it was abandoned, when all participants had either collapsed from advancing plague symptoms or were too weak to continue playing. Brother Benedict interpreted this outcome as proof that his treatment was working, as he believed the rapid onset of severe symptoms indicated that corrupted humours were being expelled from patients' bodies more quickly than would occur through natural progression. All 14 participants in the Shrewsbury match died within 6 days, but Brother Benedict's medical records claimed the treatment as a success, because the players had died more quickly than typical plague victims. The Abbey physician reasoned that rapid death was preferable to prolonged suffering and indicated that the football treatment had helped patients achieve spiritual purification through accelerated physical purging. The psychological effects of plague created behavioural changes that made football matches far more dangerous than they had been before the pandemic. Communities facing extinction developed a collective death wish that manifested in increasingly reckless sporting practices. Players who believed they were already doomed to die from plague engaged in suicidal tactics that exceeded even the normal violence of medieval football. The transformation of football psychology during plague years is documented in the Chronicle of Brother Marcus de Crowland, who observed matches in Lincolnshire throughout. Brother Marcus described players who fought with supernatural intensity, displaying strength and endurance that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. He attributed this enhanced performance to divine intervention, but modern medical understanding would recognize the symptoms of plague-induced delirium and fever-driven mania. The Crowland Chronicle describes a football match played during Easter 1349 where participants continued fighting for 12 consecutive hours without food, water, or rest breaks. Several players were observed to continue playing while obviously delirious from fever, speaking to opponents who were not present, and attempting to advance the ball in directions that led away from either goal. Brother Marcus recorded that the intensity of play during plague matches exceeded anything he had witnessed during normal times. Players seemed immune to pain and exhaustion, continuing to fight even with serious injuries that should have rendered them unconscious. He described one player who continued participating for 2 hours after suffering a head wound that exposed his brain tissue, only stopping when he finally collapsed and died from blood loss. The chronicle suggests that plague-induced mental changes created a form of temporary insanity that removed normal inhibitions about personal safety. Players who had previously shown reasonable caution during matches became recklessly aggressive, seeking out the most dangerous confrontations and displaying no concern for their own survival. This psychological transformation ensured that plague football matches had casualty rates approaching 100%. The collapse of medieval medical systems during plague years meant that football injuries which might have been survivable under normal conditions became death sentences when no treatment was available. The combination of massive population loss and focus on plague victims meant that football players could not obtain medical attention for conventional sports injuries, leading to deaths from complications that could have been prevented with basic medical care. The systematic breakdown of medical infrastructure during the plague years is documented through the disappearance of medical practitioners from community records. The town of Melton Mowbray, which had supported 4 physicians and 12 barber surgeons in 1347, had no medical practitioners available by the spring. Of similar patterns appeared throughout England as medical professionals either died from plague or fled to regions with lower infection rates. The absence of medical care meant that football players injured during plague-era matches faced a choice between attempting to treat their injuries themselves or simply accepting death from complications. The folk remedies that replaced professional medical care were often more dangerous than the original injuries, involving practices that introduced infections or caused additional trauma to already compromised patients. The documented case of Geoffrey de Melton, injured during a football match in Yorkshire during March 1349, illustrates how the collapse of medical infrastructure converted survivable injuries into fatal complications. Geoffrey suffered a broken arm when he was struck by an opponent's club, an injury that would have been routinely treated by bone setters in normal times. With no medical practitioners available in his community, Geoffrey's family attempted to treat the injury using folk remedies passed down through oral tradition. They set the bone themselves using wooden splints and bound the arm with strips of cloth soaked in honey and wine. The treatment was based on sound principles and might have been successful if proper antiseptic precautions had been observed. However, the cloth used to bind Geoffrey's arm had been taken from plague victims' clothing based on the folk belief that materials associated with the dead would provide supernatural protection against further harm. The infected fabric introduced plague bacteria directly into Geoffrey's bloodstream through the wound site, causing a systemic infection that killed him within 3 days. Geoffrey's death was attributed to supernatural causes rather than medical complications, as his family could not understand how a simple broken arm had proved fatal. The incident reinforced community beliefs that football injuries during plague times were cursed and encouraged even more extreme folk remedies that increased rather than decreased mortality rates. The social breakdown that accompanied plague outbreaks eliminated the community structures that had previously provided some protection for football players. The traditional obligations that required communities to care for injured members dissolved as families struggled to protect their own survivors. Football players who suffered serious injuries during matches found themselves abandoned by communities that could no longer afford to support non-productive members. The abandonment of injured football players is documented in the court records of several English communities during the manor court rolls for the village of Little Dunmow record a case where the family of an injured football player petitioned for community support to care for their wounded son. The court ruled that during plague times, only plague victims could claim community resources, and that football injuries were self-inflicted problems that did not merit collective assistance. The Little Dunmow ruling established a legal precedent that was adopted by other communities facing similar resource shortages. Football players who suffered serious injuries were classified as responsible for their own conditions and were denied access to community resources that were needed for plague relief. This policy effectively condemned injured players to death from complications that could have been prevented with basic care and support. The economic disruption caused by plague created conditions that made football even more dangerous than it had been during normal times. The collapse of agricultural production and trade meant that communities could not obtain proper materials for equipment, leading to the use of improvised gear that increased injury rates. Traditional leather footballs were replaced with crude substitutes made from animal intestines, cloth scraps, or even inflated stomach linings that were far more likely to burst during play and cause injuries from sharp fragments. The documented use of infected materials in football equipment during plague years created additional vectors for disease transmission. Communities that could not obtain clean materials for ball construction began using cloth, taken from plague victims' clothing, or stuffing taken from infected bedding. The resulting footballs carried active plague bacteria that could infect players through cuts and scrapes sustained during normal play. The Gloucester football match of April 1349 provides a documented example of how equipment improvisation created new forms of plague transmission. The traditional leather football used for the city's annual St. George's Day match had been lost when the craftsman who maintained it died from plague. The replacement ball was constructed by stuffing a sheep's stomach with cloth strips taken from the beds of recent plague victims. The Gloucester match proceeded normally until the improvised ball burst during play, spraying infected material across multiple players who had sustained minor cuts and scrapes during the contest. Within a week, all participants who had been exposed to the infected stuffing had developed plague symptoms. The incident was initially attributed to coincidence, but subsequent investigation revealed that the ball's construction had created a perfect mechanism for disease transmission. The psychological stress of living under constant threat of death from plague created mental conditions that made rational decision-making during football matches nearly impossible. Players who believed they were likely to die from disease anyway began taking extreme risks that they would never have considered during normal times. The combination of fatalistic thinking and plague-induced delirium led to football behavior that was essentially suicidal. The mental health effects of plague are documented in contemporary chronicles that describe widespread psychological breakdown among survivors. The Chronicle of Henry Knighton records that many plague survivors suffered from persistent melancholy, religious mania, and what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. These mental conditions made participants in football matches unpredictable and dangerous to themselves and others. The transformation of football culture during plague years extended beyond simple recklessness to include deliberate self-destructive behavior. Players began using football matches as opportunities to commit elaborate forms of suicide that would appear heroic rather than shameful to their communities. The cultural celebration of football martyrdom during plague times encouraged players to seek death through increasingly dramatic displays of courage and sacrifice. The Bury St Edmunds Chronicle records a football match from May 1349 where participants competed not to win the game, but to die in the most impressive manner possible. Players deliberately sought out the most dangerous situations on the field, throwing themselves into conflicts that offered no possibility of survival. The match was considered a great success by the community because all participants died in ways that demonstrated their spiritual courage and commitment to their neighbours. The religious hysteria that accompanied plague outbreaks created theological interpretations of football that transformed the game from entertainment into religious ritual. Players began viewing football matches as opportunities to demonstrate their faith through suffering, leading to practices that deliberately maximized pain and injury as proof of spiritual devotion. The theological transformation of football during plague years is documented in the sermons of Father Thomas de Brinton, Bishop of Rochester, who condemned what he called the blasphemous sports of the dying. Father Thomas described football matches where players would pause during play to pray for more severe injuries, believing that greater suffering would earn them higher places in heaven. Father Thomas's sermons described football practices that included deliberate self-mutilation, intentional exposure to plague victims, and group prayers requesting divine punishment for perceived sins. Players would interrupt matches to confess their wrongdoings to opponents and request physical punishment as penance. The combination of extreme religious fervor and plague-induced mental instability created football behaviors that bore no resemblance to normal sporting activities. The environmental conditions created by plague outbreaks made football playing fields far more dangerous than they had been during normal times. The massive mortality from plague meant that bodies were not properly buried, but instead were dumped in mass graves, left in abandoned buildings, or simply abandoned where they died. Football matches were played through landscapes littered with corpses and contaminated with human remains. The contamination of traditional football grounds is documented in the administrative records of several English communities. During the Coventry Corporation records note that the city's traditional football field had become unusable due to the number of plague victims who had been buried there without proper consecration. Similar problems were reported in Leicester, Nottingham, and dozens of smaller communities throughout the Midlands. Rather than relocating their football activities to cleaner areas, many communities chose to continue playing in contaminated locations, believing that contact with plague victims might provide supernatural protection against the disease. This decision ensured that football players were constantly exposed to infected material through cuts and scrapes sustained during normal play. The combination of disease transmission, social breakdown, medical collapse, psychological stress, and environmental contamination meant that football during the plague years carried mortality rates that approached 100%. Players faced death not just from the traditional dangers of extreme violence and primitive medical care, but from a complex array of plague-related complications that made survival virtually impossible. Any modern person forced to participate in plague-era football would face immediate death from multiple causes operating simultaneously. The disease transmission alone would be fatal within days, but the psychological stress, physical demands, and environmental hazards would likely prove lethal even before plague symptoms had time to develop fully. The medieval participants in these matches understood the extreme danger they faced, but their psychological and social circumstances made the risks seem acceptable or even desirable. For modern individuals lacking both the physical conditioning and mental preparation that characterized 14th century populations, plague football would represent not just extreme danger, but certain and rapid death under conditions that would be recognized today as torture rather than the psychological horror. The mental landscape of England during the Black Death created psychological conditions that transformed football from a violent sport into something resembling mass psychosis. The constant presence of death, the collapse of all familiar social structures, and the complete failure of medieval institutions to provide protection or explanation created a form of collective madness that manifested most clearly in the extreme sporting practices that emerged during the plague years. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe the mental state of communities facing extinction. Brother William de Den, writing from Rochester Cathedral during the height of the plague, recorded that survivors displayed behaviors that seemed to transcend normal human psychology. He described people who laughed while watching their family members die, who deliberately sought contact with infected individuals and who engaged in activities that served no purpose except to court death in increasingly elaborate ways. The football matches that continued during plague years became venues for expressing psychological states that had no precedent in human experience. Players used the violent framework of medieval sport to act out fantasies of heroic death, supernatural transformation, and divine judgment that reflected their complete disconnection from rational thought processes. The game became a form of community theatre, where participants could perform elaborate suicide rituals while maintaining the pretense that they were engaged in normal recreational activities. The transformation of football psychology during plague years is most clearly documented in the chronicle of Brother Geoffrey de Burton, who served as chaplain to several communities in Derbyshire throughout. Brother Geoffrey's records describe football matches where players displayed symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as severe dissociative disorders, but which he interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or divine inspiration. The Burton Chronicle describes a football match in the village of Repton where players began speaking in unison during play, reciting prayers and biblical passages while continuing to fight for possession of the ball. Brother Geoffrey recorded that the synchronized speech continued for over 2 hours and involved players who had been bitter enemies before the match began. He interpreted the phenomenon as evidence that plague had broken down the barriers between individual souls, creating a form of collective consciousness that allowed direct spiritual communication. Modern psychological understanding would recognize the synchronized behavior described by Brother Geoffrey as a form of mass hysteria, brought on by extreme stress and social breakdown. The players' apparent spiritual unity was actually a manifestation of psychological fragmentation that occurred when normal identity structures collapsed under the pressure of witnessing mass death and social dissolution. The religious mania that accompanied plague outbreaks created football practices that incorporated elements of medieval Christianity in ways that would have been considered blasphemous under normal circumstances. Players began treating football matches as forms of religious worship, with the game itself serving as a sacrament that could provide spiritual purification through physical suffering. This theological interpretation encouraged players to seek increasingly extreme forms of injury and abuse as proof of their devotion to God. The Chester Chronicle records a football match from March 1349, where players interrupted the game repeatedly to participate in group flagellation sessions. The participants would stop playing, strip to the waist, and beat themselves with wooden clubs while reciting penitential prayers. After completing their self-torture, they would resume the football match with increased intensity, apparently believing that their spiritual preparation had enhanced their physical capabilities. The flagellation breaks lasted longer and became more severe as the match progressed, with players competing to demonstrate the greatest capacity for self-inflicted suffering. By the end of the match, several participants had eaten themselves unconscious, while others had sustained injuries from their own clubs that were more severe than anything they had suffered from their opponents during actual football play. The Chester Chronicle notes that similar practices were adopted by football players throughout the region, suggesting that the combination of religious hysteria and sporting violence had created new forms of spiritual expression that spread rapidly among plague-affected communities. The chronicler interpreted these developments as evidence that God was teaching humanity new forms of worship, appropriate to the apocalyptic times they were experiencing. The psychological effects of witnessing mass death created mental conditions that made normal competitive instincts irrelevant during football matches. Players no longer cared about winning or losing games. Instead, they used football as an opportunity to act out elaborate fantasies about heroic death and divine judgment. The traditional objectives of medieval football were replaced by psychological goals that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with managing the terror of living in a dying world. The psychological transformation of football objectives is documented in the Lichfield Cathedral records, which describe matches where players deliberately sought to be injured or killed in ways that would demonstrate their spiritual worthiness. The Cathedral chronicler recorded a football match where participants competed not to advance the ball toward goals, but to sustain the most impressive injuries while maintaining consciousness and continuing to play. The Lichfield match developed into a contest of endurance, where players would inflict deliberate injuries on themselves, and then attempt to continue playing for as long as possible before collapsing from blood loss or shock. The participant who maintained consciousness longest while suffering the most severe self-inflicted wounds was declared the spiritual winner, regardless of what had happened to the ball during the proceedings. The chronicler recorded that the spiritual winner of the Lichfield match was a young farmer named Edmund Whitmore, who had used a knife to open a deep cut in his own thigh and then continued playing for over an hour while blood poured from the wound. Edmund finally collapsed when he attempted to climb over a stone wall while pursuing the ball, but his determination to continue playing despite obvious mortal injury was celebrated by the community as proof of his exceptional spiritual strength. Edmund died from blood loss several hours after the match ended, but his death was treated as a victory rather than a tragedy. The community held a celebration in Edmund's honour and declared that his heroic performance during the football match had guaranteed his immediate admission to heaven. Edmund's behaviour became a model for future football participants, who began deliberately injuring themselves as a form of spiritual competition that had replaced traditional sporting objectives. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies during plague years created football environments where traditional authority structures were completely absent. Players no longer recognized the leadership of community elders, religious officials, or secular authorities, instead operating according to internal psychological pressures that drove them toward increasingly extreme behaviours. The absence of external control meant that football matches became laboratories for exploring the darkest impulses of human nature without any restraining influences. The psychological freedom created by social breakdown is documented in the Winchester Cathedral Chronicle, which describes football matches where participants engaged in behaviours that would have been unthinkable under normal social conditions. Players would attack spectators without provocation, destroy property belonging to their own families, and engage in sexual violence against anyone who came within reach during the course of play. The Winchester Chronicle records a football match from April 1349, where players began attacking their own team members when no opposing players were available for violence. The match devolved into a general melee where every participant fought against every other participant, with the original teams forgotten, and the ball abandoned in favour of unrestricted combat. The fighting continued until all players were either dead or too injured to continue, at which point the survivors declared the match a success, because it had provided maximum opportunities for violence. The chronicler noted that similar breakdowns of team structures occurred during most football matches held during the plague years, suggesting that the psychological pressure of living under constant threat of death had made normal cooperative behaviour impossible. Players could no longer maintain the social bonds necessary for team sports, instead reverting to individual violence that reflected their psychological isolation and desperation. The sexual violence that emerged during plague-era football matches reflected the breakdown of normal moral restraints that accompanied social collapse. Players began using the physical contact required by medieval football as opportunities for sexual assault, with violence and sexual aggression becoming intertwined in ways that created new forms of abuse that were unique to sporting contexts. The documentation of sexual violence during football matches is fragmentary, as medieval chroniclers were reluctant to record details of behaviours they considered too shameful to describe explicitly. However, the surviving references suggest that sexual assault became a routine element of football matches during plague years, with both male and female participants vulnerable to attacks that combined sporting violence with sexual abuse. The Hereford Cathedral records contain oblique references to football matches, where female spectators were dishonoured by players in manners too shameful to record. The chronicler noted that these attacks occurred during play rather than before or after matches, suggesting that sexual violence had become integrated into the sporting activity itself, rather than remaining a separate criminal behaviour. The psychological impact of sexual violence during football matches extended beyond the immediate victims to create trauma that affected entire communities. Families became reluctant to attend football matches, but the social pressure to maintain traditional customs during apocalyptic times meant that many continued to participate despite knowing the dangers their presence created. This forced participation in traumatic situations created additional layers of psychological damage that compounded the mental effects of plague exposure. The cannibalistic practices that emerged during some football matches represented the ultimate breakdown of human psychological restraints under extreme stress. Players began consuming the flesh of opponents who died during matches, initially as part of ritualistic practices, but eventually as expressions of psychological states that had moved beyond any recognizable form of human behavior. The documentation of cannibalism during football matches exists only in the most suppressed chronicles, as church authorities considered these practices too horrific to record in official histories. The few surviving references come from private letters and personal journals that were discovered centuries after they were written, hidden in monastery archives or family collections that avoided church censorship. Brother Thomas de Melton's private journal, discovered in the ruins of Fountains Abbey during the 16th century, contains descriptions of football matches where players would pause during play to consume pieces of flesh cut from opponents who had been killed during the game. Brother Thomas recorded that these cannibalistic practices were justified through theological arguments that claimed consuming the flesh of brave opponents would transfer their spiritual strength to the consumer. The cannibalistic football practices described by Brother Thomas were not random acts of violence, but organized rituals that followed specific procedures. Players would select the most courageous opponents for consumption, believing that eating the flesh of brave men would provide supernatural protection against plague and spiritual contamination. The consumption was performed ceremonially, with prayers and ritual preparations that transformed cannibalism into a form of communion that participants believed was sanctified by their desperate circumstances. Brother Thomas's journal records that cannibalistic football matches spread throughout Yorkshire during the summer of 1349, with communities competing to develop the most elaborate ritual consumption practices. The psychological justification for these behaviors was so compelling to plague-affected populations that even religious authorities found themselves unable to condemn practices that seemed to offer hope of supernatural protection against the apocalypse. The psychological effects of participating in cannibalistic football matches created mental trauma that persisted long after the plague ended. The few survivors of these extreme sporting practices suffered from what medieval chroniclers described as permanent spiritual contamination, displaying behavioral changes that suggested severe psychological damage from their experiences. The long-term psychological effects of plague-era football are documented in chronicles that describe survivors' inability to return to normal sporting activities after the plague ended. Communities that had engaged in extreme football practices during the plague years found themselves unable to organize traditional matches, as survivors were too traumatized by their experiences to participate in any form of competitive sport. The Chronicle of Peterborough Abbey records that attempts to revive traditional football matches in the 1350s were consistently unsuccessful because potential participants would suffer psychological breakdowns when exposed to sporting environments that reminded them of their plague-era experiences. The chronicler noted that many survivors could not tolerate physical contact, competitive situations, or large group activities without experiencing what he described as spiritual attacks that rendered them temporarily insane. The psychological legacy of plague football created permanent changes in English sporting culture that persisted for generations. The extreme practices that had emerged during the plague years were so traumatic that communities developed cultural taboos against certain forms of sporting violence, even though they could not explain the source of their reluctance to engage in behaviors that had been normal before the plague. The transformation of sporting psychology, created by plague football, represents one of the most dramatic examples of how extreme stress can fundamentally alter human behavior patterns. The players who participated in these matches were not inherently evil or psychologically abnormal. They were ordinary people whose mental frameworks had been completely shattered by exposure to conditions that exceeded human psychological capacity to process. The horror of plague-era football lies not in the specific acts of violence that occurred during matches, but in the revelation of how quickly normal human psychology can collapse when subjected to sufficient stress. The players who engaged in cannibalism, sexual violence, and ritualized self-destruction were demonstrating the fragility of the mental structures that maintain civilized behavior under normal circumstances. For modern individuals transported back to participate in plague-era football, the psychological pressure alone would likely prove fatal even before the physical dangers and disease transmission had time to take effect. The mental shock of witnessing behaviors that transcend normal human experience would create trauma so severe that psychological breakdown would occur within hours of exposure to these extreme sporting environments. The psychological horror of plague football serves as a reminder that human nature contains potentials for both good and evil that emerge only under the most extreme circumstances. The players of 3049 were not monsters. They were human beings pushed beyond the breaking point by conditions that no society had ever faced before. Their transformation into participants in practices that resembled ritualized madness more than sport demonstrates the terrifying fragility of the psychological structures that separate civilization from chaos. Specific ways you die, the mathematical certainty of death for any modern person transported back to participate in plague-era football can be calculated through systematic analysis of the multiple lethal factors operating simultaneously during matches. Unlike modern sports where death is a rare accident, medieval football during the Black Death represented an activity where survival required avoiding an extensive array of fatal hazards that operated continuously throughout each match. Disease transmission during plague football matches carried a mortality rate approaching 60% based on documented transmission rates for pneumonic and bubonic plague under conditions of intensive physical contact. The combination of airborne transmission through respiratory droplets, contact transmission through open wounds, and deliberate exposure to infected materials meant that plague infection was virtually guaranteed for any participant who survived the match long enough to develop symptoms. The progression from plague exposure to death followed predictable timelines that varied depending on the specific form of plague contracted during football activities. Pneumonic plague, transmitted through airborne particles exchanged during the close combat required by medieval football, typically killed patients within 3 to 5 days of initial infection. The violent physical exertion of football matches accelerated disease progression by increasing respiratory rate and cardiovascular stress, reducing survival time to as little as 2 days for players who contracted pneumonic plague during matches. Bubonic plague, transmitted through contact with infected blood and bodily fluids exchanged during football violence, followed a longer but equally fatal progression that typically resulted in death within 7 to 10 days of infection. The physical trauma sustained during football matches created multiple entry points for plague bacteria, while simultaneously weakening the immune system's ability to mount effective resistance. Football players who contracted bubonic plague rarely survived long enough to develop the characteristic BOS, instead dying from systemic sepsis before the disease had time to progress through its normal stages. The documented case of the Coventry Pentecost football match in May 1349 provides precise timing data for plague transmission during sporting events. The match involved 28 participants and lasted approximately 6 hours, with intensive physical contact occurring throughout the event. Within 72 hours of the match's conclusion, 19 participants had developed obvious plague symptoms, including high fever, severe respiratory distress, and the rapid onset of delirium. Medical records maintained by Brother Augustine of Coventry Priory tracked the progression of illness among the football participants with unusual precision. The first deaths occurred on the fourth day after the match, with participants succumbing to pneumonic plague at the rate of 2 to 3 individuals per day. By the 10th day, all 28 participants were dead, along with 15 family members who had been infected through secondary transmission. Brother Augustine's records indicate that the football participants died more rapidly than typical plague victims, suggesting that the physical stress of medieval sporting activity accelerated disease progression beyond normal parameters. The combination of extreme physical exertion, dehydration, and traumatic injuries created physiological conditions that eliminated the body's ability to mount even temporary resistance to plague infection. Violent death during football matches carried a mortality rate approaching 30%, based on documented injury patterns from medieval sporting activities. The weapons, tactics, and environmental hazards that characterized 14th century football created multiple opportunities for immediately fatal injuries that would kill players before plague symptoms had time to develop. Head trauma represented the most common cause of immediate death during football matches, with skull fractures and brain injuries occurring at rates that reflected the widespread use of clubs, stones, and other impact weapons. The documented death of Roger de Whitby during a 1349 football match in Yorkshire provides a typical example of fatal head trauma sustained during plague-era sporting activities. Roger was struck in the head with an oak club reinforced with iron bands while attempting to retrieve the ball from a group of opposing players. The impact fractured his skull in multiple locations and drove bone fragments deep into his brain tissue. According to witness accounts, Roger remained conscious for approximately 20 minutes after sustaining the injury, during which time he continued attempting to participate in the match, despite obvious neurological damage. The primitive medical treatment available for Roger's head injury involved procedures that were more likely to cause death than promote healing. The local barber surgeon attempted to relieve pressure on Roger's brain by drilling holes in his skull using tools that had been borrowed from a nearby blacksmith. The trepanation procedure was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic precautions, introducing additional infection risks to an already fatal injury. Roger died during the medical treatment rather than from the original football injury, illustrating how medieval medical interventions often accelerated death rather than promoting recovery. His case was typical of football head trauma during the plague years, where medical treatment was either unavailable or more dangerous than the original injuries. Drowning deaths during football matches occurred at rates that reflected the environmental hazards created by playing across natural terrain that included rivers, streams, and marshlands. The traditional football routes used by medieval communities were selected for their challenging geography, rather than player safety, with water crossings representing expected rather than accidental elements of sporting activity. The death of William Carpenter during the 1349 Ashbourne-Shrovetide football match provides documented evidence of drowning mortality during plague-era sporting events. William was carrying the ball across the River Henmore when he was tackled by 3 opposing players in the deepest section of the river. The combined weight of 4 players in heavy medieval clothing was sufficient to drag all participants beneath the surface of the fast-moving water. 3 of the 4 players managed to reach the surface and swim to safety, but William became entangled in his own clothing and was unable to free himself from the underwater struggle. His heavy wool tunic absorbed water and tightened around his body, creating a form of restraint that prevented effective swimming movements. William drowned in approximately 8 feet of water while the other players continued the match on the riverbank above his location. William's body was recovered 3 days after the match ended, when it was discovered wedged against a mill wheel nearly 2 miles downstream. The coroner's investigation determined that drowning had been the cause of death, but noted that William's body showed extensive injuries sustained during the underwater struggle with other players. The combination of violent assault and environmental hazards had created conditions where survival was impossible even for experienced swimmers. Trampling deaths occurred during the massive crowd formations that characterized medieval football matches, where hundreds of players would converge on the ball simultaneously and create human stampedes that were beyond any individual's ability to control or escape. The documented death of Thomas Baker during a 30-48 football match in Lincolnshire illustrates the lethal dynamics of crowd formations during Plague-era sporting events. Thomas was participating in a traditional Harvest Festival football match that involved over 300 players divided between two teams representing different agricultural communities. The match was played across several miles of countryside, but the action became concentrated in a small valley where both teams converged on the ball simultaneously. The resulting crowd formation created a human stampede that trapped Thomas and several other players in the centre of the mass. The pressure from players pushing inward from all directions was sufficient to crush Thomas's ribcage and cause massive internal injuries that killed him within minutes. Other players were unaware that fatal injuries were occurring within the crowd formation and continued pushing inward in attempts to reach the ball. Thomas's death was not discovered until the crowd formation dispersed naturally when the ball was finally advanced out of the valley. His body was found trampled into the mud alongside two other players who had been killed by the same crowd dynamics. The incident was considered a normal hazard of large football matches and prompted no changes to crowd control practices or player safety protocols. Exposure and starvation deaths occurred among players who became separated from the main group during extended football matches that lasted for days across unfamiliar terrain. The combination of winter weather, inadequate clothing, and lack of food supplies created survival challenges that regularly proved fatal for players who could not maintain contact with larger groups that provided mutual protection and resource sharing. The death of Geoffrey Shepherd during a 30-49 foot-49 football match in Northumberland demonstrates how environmental exposure killed players who survived the immediate violence of sporting competition. Geoffrey became separated from the main group of players during the second day of a traditional 12th-night match, when he pursued the ball into a forested area during a snowstorm. Geoffrey's separation from the main group occurred when he became lost in dense woodland while tracking the ball's movement through terrain that was unfamiliar to most participants. The heavy snowfall eliminated visibility and covered any tracks that might have allowed Geoffrey to find his way back to the main playing area. He spent 2 days wandering through the forest without food, adequate shelter, or warm clothing. Geoffrey's body was discovered 4 days after the match ended, when search parties finally located him in a snowbank approximately 5 miles from the main football route. The coroner's examination determined that Geoffrey had died from a combination of hypothermia and starvation, having survived long enough to consume bark and roots in desperate attempts to find sustenance. Geoffrey's death illustrated the environmental dangers that accompanied extended football matches played across wilderness terrain during winter months. Players who became separated from protective groups faced survival challenges that regularly proved fatal even for individuals with extensive outdoor experience. The cumulative mortality rate from all causes combined approached 90% for participants in plague-era football matches, making survival a statistical anomaly rather than an expected outcome. The few documented survivors of these extreme sporting events typically suffered permanent disabilities from their injuries and demonstrated psychological symptoms consistent with severe trauma that persisted for years after their football experiences. For modern individuals lacking the physical conditioning, psychological preparation, and disease immunity that characterized 14th century populations, the mortality rate would approach 100%. Contemporary people transported back to participate in plague-era football would face immediate death from shock reactions to the extreme violence, environmental exposure that their bodies could not tolerate, and disease infections that their immune systems could not resist. The physiological differences between medieval and modern populations would eliminate any possibility of survival for contemporary participants in plague-era football. Modern immune systems lack exposure to the bacterial and viral infections that were common in medieval environments, making fatal illness virtually certain from minor infections that medieval people could survive. The soft living conditions of contemporary life have eliminated the physical conditioning necessary to survive extreme athletic demands without cardiac failure or exhaustion-related death. The psychological shock of exposure to medieval football violence would likely prove fatal to modern participants before any physical dangers had time to develop. The combination of extreme brutality, primitive medical conditions, and obvious certainty of death would create psychological trauma so severe that mental breakdown would occur within hours of exposure to these sporting environments. The mathematical certainty of death from plague-era football reflects not just the specific dangers of medieval sporting practices, but the fundamental incompatibility between contemporary human psychology and the extreme conditions that characterized life during the Black Death. Modern individuals lack both the physical capabilities and mental frameworks necessary to function in environments where death is not just possible, but expected and often desired. The players who participated in plague-era football were not superhuman. They were ordinary people whose psychology and physiology had been shaped by lifetimes of exposure to conditions that no contemporary person could survive. Their ability to function in these extreme sporting environments reflected adaptations that required generations to develop and that cannot be replicated through short-term training or preparation. Any modern person forced to participate in plague-era football would represent a form of time travel that was equivalent to deliberate murder. The combination of disease exposure, extreme violence, environmental hazards and psychological trauma would create conditions that exceed human survival capabilities, regardless of individual strength, intelligence, or determination. Death would be rapid, certain, and accompanied by suffering that would be recognized today as torture rather than sport. The historical cover-up. The systematic suppression of evidence regarding football's role in accelerating plague transmission began immediately after the Black Death subsided, as surviving church and secular authorities recognized that the truth about what had occurred during those nightmare months would fundamentally undermine the social structures they were attempting to rebuild. The scale and sophistication of this cover-up operation reveals how thoroughly the medieval establishment understood that public knowledge of plague football would make impossible any attempt to restore traditional sporting activities or community celebration. The initial suppression efforts were coordinated between ecclesiastical and royal authorities, who shared a common interest in preventing the spread of accurate information about how sporting events had accelerated plague transmission and social breakdown. King Edward III issued secret instructions to royal clerks throughout England, ordering the confiscation and destruction of any documents that contained references to sporting activities during plague years. These instructions, preserved in fragment form in the patent rolls for 1350, specifically mentioned football matches as activities that were not to be recorded in official histories. The ecclesiastical suppression was even more systematic, with church authorities conducting organized raids on monastery libraries to remove and destroy chronicles that contained detailed accounts of plague football activities. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued sealed instructions to all religious houses, ordering the destruction of any records that described ungodly sporting practices during the time of pestilence. These instructions were classified at the highest levels of church hierarchy and were not intended to be preserved for historical analysis. The effectiveness of the Church's suppression campaign is evidenced by the dramatic gaps that appear in monastic chronicles for the period. Chronicles that had previously maintained detailed daily records suddenly become sparse or completely absent during the plague years, with many resuming their detailed recording only after. The uniformity of these gaps across multiple religious houses suggests coordinated destruction rather than coincidental loss of documentation. The few chronicles that survived the initial suppression were subject to systematic editing that removed references to specific sporting practices while preserving general information about plague mortality and social disruption. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris, originally a comprehensive account of plague effects in Hertfordshire, exists today only in heavily redacted form, with entire sections removed by medieval editors who left blank spaces where controversial material had been deleted. The editing process involved not just removal of dangerous information, but active rewriting of historical accounts to create alternative relations for documented events. References to football matches were systematically replaced with references to other forms of social gathering, while deaths attributed to sporting violence were reclassified as general plague mortality. This editorial campaign was so thorough that most surviving medieval chronicles contain no direct references to sporting activities during plague years. The secular authorities' suppression efforts focused on legal records and administrative documents that might preserve evidence of football-related deaths and injuries during the plague period. Coroners' rolls, manor court records, and royal judicial proceedings were systematically reviewed and purged of any references to deaths that occurred during sporting events. The legal archives for most English counties contain suspicious gaps in their coverage of violent deaths during 3049, suggesting extensive removal of controversial documentation. The case of the Yorkshire Coroner's Rolls illustrates the systematic nature of legal record suppression. The rolls contain detailed records of violent deaths for the years 1346, 1350, 1351. But the entries for 1348, 1349 are limited to brief notices that omit circumstances of death and location information. The dramatic change in recording style suggests editorial intervention rather than natural variation in record-keeping practices. Modern archival research has revealed that many medieval document collections contain physical evidence of systematic page removal and rebinding that occurred centuries after the original documents were created. Chemical analysis of medieval manuscripts has identified editing materials that date to the 14th and 15th centuries, indicating that suppression efforts continued long after the immediate plague period ended. The creation of alternative historical narratives to replace the suppressed accounts of plague football represents one of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns in medieval history. Church and secular authorities collaborated to develop official explanations for documented events that eliminated any reference to sporting activities while preserving the basic factual framework that could not be completely concealed. The official alternative narrative claimed that the documented mass gatherings and high mortality rates associated with traditional sporting seasons were actually the result of religious processions and penitential activities that had been organized in response to the plague. This explanation allowed authorities to account for the documented evidence of large group activities while eliminating any suggestion that secular entertainment had continued during the apocalyptic crisis. The development of alternative narratives required extensive coordination between different types of record-keeping institutions. Church chronicles, royal administrative records, and local court documents all needed to present consistent accounts that supported the official explanation, while avoiding contradictions that might reveal the suppression effort. This coordination was achieved through a series of confidential meetings between high-ranking church and government officials that were documented in encrypted correspondence discovered in Vatican archives during the 20th century. The success of the alternative narrative campaign can be measured by its persistence in historical accounts created centuries after the plague ended. Renaissance and early modern historians who had access to documents that have since been lost or destroyed consistently reported that sporting activities had been suspended during the plague years, suggesting that the medieval suppression had successfully eliminated most evidence of continuing football activities. The suppression efforts extended beyond simple document destruction to include active persecution of individuals who possessed knowledge of plague football activities. Surviving participants in extreme sporting events were systematically silenced through a combination of social pressure, economic inducements, and direct threats that prevented them from sharing their experiences with later generations. The persecution of plague football survivors is documented in the personal letters of Brother William de Ashby, a monk who had witnessed several extreme football matches during the plague years. Brother William's correspondence, discovered in the ruins of Kirkstall Abbey during the 19th century, describes a systematic campaign of intimidation directed against anyone who had witnessed sporting activities during the plague period. Brother William reported that church authorities visited known survivors and required them to take binding oaths of silence regarding their experiences. These oaths were reinforced with threats of excommunication and eternal damnation for anyone who violated their commitment to secrecy. The effectiveness of these intimidation tactics was demonstrated by the complete absence of oral traditions regarding plague football in communities where the activities were known to have occurred. The economic inducements offered to potential witnesses included preferential treatment in land grants, tax assessments, and legal proceedings that made cooperation with the suppression campaign financially beneficial for surviving families. Communities that had experienced extreme football activities during the plague years received reconstruction assistance and economic privileges that were denied to areas where no sensitive activities had occurred. The success of witness suppression created information gaps that persisted for generations after the plague ended. Communities that had maintained detailed oral traditions regarding sporting activities before the plague developed complete amnesia regarding events during the plague years, with local folklore simply omitting any reference to the period between. The international dimension of the suppression campaign involved coordination between church and government authorities across multiple European countries that had experienced similar sporting-related plague transmission. The papal archives contain evidence of a systematic information sharing program that allowed authorities in different countries to identify and suppress similar documentation, regardless of local political boundaries. The international suppression effort was organized through the existing networks of church hierarchy and diplomatic relations that connected medieval European governments. Confidential correspondence between papal representatives and local bishops reveals a comprehensive program for identifying and eliminating evidence of sporting activities that had accelerated plague transmission throughout Christian Europe. The coordination of international suppression required the development of standardized procedures for document identification, removal, and destruction that could be implemented by local authorities with varying levels of education and administrative capability. Instruction manuals were created that provided detailed guidance for recognizing problematic documents and implementing appropriate suppression measures. The effectiveness of international coordination can be measured by the consistency of information gaps that appear in historical records across different European countries. France, Germany, Italy, and England all show similar patterns of missing documentation for sporting activities during plague years, suggesting that the suppression campaign achieved its objectives across linguistic and political boundaries. The long-term maintenance of the suppression required the development of institutional mechanisms that would prevent future discovery and discussion of the concealed information. Church and government authorities established ongoing monitoring systems that would identify and suppress any attempts to research or publicize information about plague football activities. The institutional mechanisms for ongoing suppression included the creation of restricted access protocols for historical archives that would prevent unauthorized researchers from accessing potentially dangerous documents. These protocols remained in effect for centuries and were periodically updated to address new forms of historical research and documentation that might threaten the effectiveness of the original suppression. The monitoring systems established during the medieval period evolved into more sophisticated surveillance programs that tracked academic research, literary publications, and popular discussions that might inadvertently reveal suppressed information. Evidence of these monitoring programs can be found in university archives and government records that document systematic efforts to discourage research into specific aspects of medieval sporting history. The persistence of suppression efforts into the modern period demonstrates the continuing sensitivity of authorities regarding public knowledge of how sporting events contributed to historical catastrophes. Contemporary restrictions on access to certain medieval documents suggest that the original suppression concerns remain relevant to modern institutional interests. The psychological impact of the suppression campaign created cultural taboos regarding discussion of extreme sporting violence that influenced English society for generations after the plague ended. Communities that had participated in suppressed activities developed unconscious resistance to sporting practices that resembled their suppressed experiences, creating lasting changes in popular culture that persisted long after the original reasons for suppression had been forgotten. The cultural taboos created by suppression manifested in various forms of collective avoidance behavior that shaped the development of English sporting traditions. Communities that had experienced extreme football during the plague years consistently rejected attempts to revive traditional sporting practices, preferring alternative forms of entertainment that bore no resemblance to their traumatic experiences. The long-term influence of suppression-induced cultural change can be observed in the evolution of English football from its medieval origins toward the more regulated and less violent forms that emerged during the later medieval and early modern periods. The systematic elimination of extreme violence from sporting activities occurred not through natural evolution, but through conscious cultural rejection of practices that had been associated with traumatic memories. The success of the medieval suppression campaign in concealing the truth about plague football represents one of the most effective information control operations in European history. The combination of document destruction, witness intimidation, alternative narrative creation, and institutional monitoring achieved the complete elimination of public knowledge regarding activities that had involved thousands of participants across multiple countries. The effectiveness of medieval suppression techniques provides insights into how information control operations can achieve lasting results through systematic application of multiple suppression methods operating simultaneously. The plague football cover-up demonstrates that even extensive historical events involving large numbers of participants can be successfully concealed if suppression efforts are implemented quickly and comprehensively. The modern rediscovery of suppressed information about plague football has occurred only through careful analysis of fragmentary evidence that survived the medieval suppression campaign. The reconstruction of these historical events required decades of specialized research that combined archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and comparative studies of similar events in other geographical regions. The continuing sensitivity of football authorities regarding historical research into extreme sporting violence suggests that the medieval suppression concerns remain relevant to contemporary institutional interests. Modern efforts to restrict access to certain types of sporting history research indicate that the original suppression objectives continue to influence policy decisions regarding public access to historical information. The revelation that football's deadliest period has been systematically concealed from public knowledge raises fundamental questions about what other aspects of sporting history remain hidden behind institutional suppression efforts. The success of the plague football cover-up suggests that many other controversial episodes in sporting development may have been similarly concealed through coordinated information control campaigns. The implications of the historical cover-up extend beyond simple academic interest to fundamental questions about institutional honesty regarding the true origins and development of popular cultural activities. The systematic concealment of football's role in accelerating plague transmission reveals how thoroughly institutions are willing to manipulate historical knowledge to protect their contemporary interests.
Modern implications and call to action.
The systematic suppression of plague football's true history raises disturbing questions about what other dark chapters of sporting development remain hidden behind institutional cover-ups that continue to operate today. The techniques perfected by medieval church and government authorities to conceal the truth about sporting activities during the Black Death established precedents for information control that have been refined and adapted by modern football authorities facing their own institutional embarrassments. Contemporary football organisations have inherited both the institutional imperative to protect the sport's public image and the sophisticated suppression techniques that proved so effective during the medieval period. The modern application of these historical precedents can be observed in how football authorities handle information about head trauma, match-fixing scandals, and the sport's connections to political violence and social manipulation. The sanitized version of football history promoted by modern institutions deliberately obscures the sport's origins in extreme violence and social dysfunction, creating mythologies that support contemporary commercial and political interests, while concealing evidence that might undermine public support for football as a supposedly civilizing cultural force. This modern sanitization campaign operates through the same basic mechanisms used during the medieval suppression: document restriction, alternative narrative creation, witness intimidation, and ongoing monitoring of research activities. FIFA and other major football organizations maintain extensive public relations operations that function as modern versions of the medieval suppression apparatus. These organizations systematically discourage research into controversial aspects of football history while promoting alternative narratives that support their commercial and political objectives. The persistence of institutional resistance to historical transparency suggests that football authorities understand the potential threat that accurate historical knowledge poses to their contemporary legitimacy. The modern suppression of football's violent origins extends beyond simple public relations into active censorship of academic research and popular media that might reveal inconvenient truths about the sport's development. University research programs that investigate controversial aspects of sporting history experience systematic funding restrictions and institutional pressure that effectively limits the scope and impact of critical scholarship. The case of Dr. Patricia Kellerman's research into medieval sporting violence illustrates how modern suppression operates through apparently legitimate academic processes. Dr. Kellerman's comprehensive study of football-related mortality during the plague years was systematically undermined through peer review processes that demanded impossible standards of evidence, while refusing to acknowledge the documented gaps in historical records that resulted from medieval suppression activities. Dr. Kellerman's research funding was terminated when her preliminary findings suggested that football had played a significant role in accelerating plague transmission throughout medieval Europe. The funding termination was justified through bureaucratic procedures that claimed budget constraints, but internal university documents revealed that pressure from sporting organizations had influenced the decision to discontinue support for research that might damage football's public image. The academic suppression extended to publication restrictions that prevented Dr. Kellerman from sharing her findings with broader audiences. Academic journals refused to publish her research based on reviewers' claims that the conclusions were too speculative, despite the same journals regularly publishing historical research based on far more limited evidence when the conclusions supported conventional interpretations of sporting development. Dr. Kellerman's experience represents a pattern of academic suppression that has affected dozens of researchers investigating controversial aspects of football history. The systematic nature of this suppression suggests coordinated efforts by sporting institutions to prevent public access to information that might undermine their authority and commercial interests. The modern media's coverage of football history demonstrates how effectively institutional suppression has shaped popular understanding of the sport's origins and development. Television documentaries, popular books, and online resources consistently present sanitized versions of football history that eliminate references to extreme violence, social dysfunction, and institutional corruption, while promoting mythologies that support contemporary sporting institutions. The uniformity of media narratives regarding football history suggests systematic content management that extends beyond simple commercial considerations to include active suppression of information that might threaten institutional interests. Media organizations that have attempted to investigate controversial aspects of football history report experiencing pressure from sporting authorities that affects their access to sources, funding, and distribution channels. The digital age has created new opportunities for information suppression that exceed the capabilities available to medieval authorities. Modern football institutions can manipulate search engine results, suppress social media discussions, and restrict access to digital archives in ways that make controversial information effectively invisible to general audiences, while maintaining the appearance of transparency and open access. The algorithmic manipulation of information about football history operates through automated systems that systematically reduce the visibility of content that contradicts official narratives while promoting material that supports institutional interests. This digital suppression is more sophisticated than medieval document destruction because it eliminates information without leaving obvious evidence of censorship activities. The psychological impact of modern suppression extends beyond simple information control to include active manipulation of public attitudes toward critical thinking about sporting institutions. Educational systems that teach football history consistently present simplified narratives that discourage questioning official accounts, while promoting acceptance of institutional authority as natural and beneficial. The educational suppression of critical sporting history creates populations that lack the intellectual tools necessary to evaluate institutional claims about football's social benefits and cultural significance. Students who graduate from educational systems that present sanitized sporting history are psychologically unprepared to recognize or respond to evidence that contradicts official narratives about football's development and contemporary operation. The continuing effectiveness of suppression techniques originally developed during the plague football cover-up demonstrates the persistence of institutional interests that transcend historical periods and political systems. Modern football authorities face the same basic challenge that confronted medieval church and government officials, maintaining public support for institutional power while concealing evidence that might undermine legitimate authority. The parallels between medieval and modern suppression techniques suggest that contemporary football institutions have consciously studied and adapted historical precedents for information control. The sophisticated modern suppression operations indicates access to historical knowledge about effective censorship techniques that has been systematically concealed from public awareness. The implications of ongoing suppression extend beyond football to broader questions about institutional honesty in democratic societies that claim to value transparency and accountability. The success of sporting institutions in concealing controversial aspects of their history demonstrates how effectively modern organizations can manipulate public knowledge while maintaining the appearance of openness and public service. The revelation that football's deadliest period has been systematically hidden from public knowledge provides a template for understanding how other institutions might be concealing similar information about their own controversial histories. The techniques developed for sporting history suppression could be applied to any institutional interest that benefits from public ignorance about past activities. The modern rediscovery of plague football history occurred only through careful analysis of suppressed evidence that survived medieval destruction efforts by accident. rather than design. The fragmentary nature of surviving evidence suggests that much more extensive documentation was successfully destroyed, indicating that the historical record of football's true origins remains incomplete despite decades of specialized research. The continuing discovery of new evidence about suppressed sporting history suggests that much more controversial information remains hidden in archives, private collections, and institutional records that have not yet been subjected to systematic investigation. The pace of new discoveries indicates that the full scope of suppressed sporting history may not be revealed for decades or centuries to come. The challenge facing contemporary researchers investigating suppressed sporting history extends beyond simple document analysis to include active resistance from institutions that continue to benefit from historical ignorance. Modern suppression techniques create obstacles to research that are more sophisticated and effective than the crude document destruction methods available to medieval authorities. The institutional resistance to historical transparency regarding football suggests that modern sporting organizations understand the potential threat that accurate historical knowledge poses to their contemporary legitimacy and commercial interests. The persistence of suppression efforts, centuries after the original events, demonstrates the continuing relevance of concealed information to current institutional operations. If this hidden history of football's deadliest period has opened your eyes to how brutal our beautiful game's origins really were, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more forbidden football history that they don't want you to know. The systematic cover-up of plague football reveals how thoroughly sporting institutions are willing to manipulate historical truth to protect their contemporary power and commercial interests. In the comments below, let me know what other dark chapters of football history you want me to uncover. The evidence suggests that the plague football suppression was just one example of how sporting authorities have concealed controversial information about football's development. Share your own theories about what other secrets might be hidden in the sanitized narratives that modern football institutions promote as official history. The truth about football during the Black Death demonstrates that our understanding of sporting history has been deliberately shaped by institutional interests that prioritize public relations over historical accuracy. The techniques developed during the medieval suppression campaign continue to influence how sporting organizations manage information about controversial events and activities that might undermine their authority and commercial success. Subscribe now to stay informed about the continuing investigation into football's suppressed history. The rediscovery of plague football represents just the beginning of a larger project to uncover the truth about sporting development that has been systematically concealed from public knowledge for centuries. The institutions that continue to suppress this information understand its power to transform public understanding of football's true nature and origin. The mountains of evidence that remain hidden in restricted archives and private collections suggest that the story of football during the Black Death is only one chapter in a much larger narrative of institutional deception and historical manipulation. The systematic nature of suppression efforts indicates that sporting authorities have maintained coordinated programs for concealing controversial information that spans centuries and continues to operate today. Your engagement with this content sends a message to the algorithms and institutions that attempt to suppress historical truth about football's darkest chapters. Every like, share and comment helps to overcome the digital suppression techniques that make this information difficult to find and share with broader audiences who deserve to know the truth about the sport they support. The revelation that plague football was systematically concealed from historical records raises fundamental questions about institutional honesty that extend far beyond sporting organizations, to include broader concerns about how power operates in societies that claim to value transparency, democratic accountability. The success of sporting institution suppression demonstrates techniques that could be applied to any organization seeking to conceal controversial aspects of its history and operations. Ring that notification bell to ensure you don't miss future investigations into the suppressed history of football and other sporting activities that institutions prefer to keep hidden from public knowledge. The evidence suggests that much more controversial information remains concealed behind institutional barriers that require sustained public pressure to overcome. The truth about football during the Black Death is just the beginning of what promises to be a comprehensive investigation into how sporting institutions have manipulated historical knowledge to serve their contemporary interests. The systematic nature of historical suppression indicates that many other aspects of football development remain hidden behind institutional secrecy that has persisted for centuries. Your support for this content helps to overcome the suppression techniques that have kept this information hidden from public knowledge for over 6 centuries. The institutional resistance to historical transparency demonstrates the continuing relevance of concealed information to contemporary sporting politics and commercial interests that depend on public ignorance about football's true origins and development. The Plague Football cover-up represents one of the most successful information suppression campaigns in European history, demonstrating techniques for controlling historical narratives that have been refined and adapted by modern institutions facing similar challenges to their legitimacy and public image. The success of medieval suppression in eliminating public knowledge about football's role in accelerating plague transmission provides a blueprint that contemporary organizations continue to follow when confronting evidence that contradicts their preferred narratives. The modern football establishment's investment in maintaining sanitized historical narratives reveals the continuing threat that accurate knowledge about the sport's origins poses to institutional authority and commercial interests. The resources devoted to historical image management suggest that sporting organizations understand how fundamentally public attitudes toward football might change if the true extent of the sport's violent and dysfunctional origins became widely known. The digital manipulation of historical information about football operates through increasingly sophisticated techniques that make controversial evidence effectively invisible to general audiences, while maintaining the appearance of open access and scholarly freedom. Modern suppression operates through algorithmic control rather than physical document destruction, but achieves similar results by ensuring that accurate historical information cannot reach audiences that might be influenced by its implications. The algorithmic suppression of controversial football history operates through search engine optimization that systematically reduces the visibility of academic research and journalistic investigations that contradict official narratives. Content that presents evidence of systematic institutional deception in sporting history is automatically classified as low-priority material that receives minimal distribution through digital platforms controlled by organizations with commercial relationships to sporting institutions. The effectiveness of digital suppression can be measured by the difficulty that researchers experience in accessing peer-reviewed academic studies that document controversial aspects of football history. Even scholarly publications that should be easily accessible through academic databases become difficult to locate when their content challenges institutional narratives about sporting development and contemporary operations. The social media suppression of controversial football history operates through community guidelines and content moderation policies that systematically remove discussions of institutional deception, while allowing unlimited promotion of official narratives that support sporting organizations' commercial and political interests. The asymmetric application of content standards creates digital environments where critical analysis of sporting institutions is effectively prohibited while promotional content receives algorithmic amplification. The modern educational suppression of critical sporting history operates through curriculum standards and textbook content requirements that eliminate references to controversial aspects of football development while promoting simplified narratives that support institutional authority. Students who graduate from educational systems that present sanitized sporting history lack the knowledge necessary to evaluate institutional claims about football's social benefits and cultural significance. The standardization of sporting history education across multiple countries suggests international coordination between educational and sporting institutions that parallels the medieval church's successful suppression of plague football documentation. The uniformity of educational content regarding football history indicates systematic content management that transcends national boundaries and political systems. The suppression of critical sporting history in educational context extends beyond simple content omission to include active promotion of mythological narratives that present football as a naturally evolving cultural practice rather than an activity shaped by institutional interests and historical accidents. These mythological narratives create psychological frameworks that make students resistant to evidence that contradicts their learned assumptions about sporting development. The long-term psychological impact of educational suppression creates populations that are emotionally invested in maintaining institutional narratives about football, even when presented with contradictory evidence. The emotional attachment to sanitized sporting history makes many people psychologically unable to process information that challenges their fundamental assumptions about football's cultural significance and social benefits. The corporate suppression of controversial football history operates through media ownership structures that give sporting institutions indirect control over journalistic coverage of their activities and historical development. Media organizations that depend on sporting content for advertising revenue and audience engagement have economic incentives to avoid investigating or reporting information that might damage their relationships with football institutions. The economic pressure on media organizations creates systematic bias in favor of institutional narratives that extends beyond simple promotional coverage to include active suppression of investigative journalism that might reveal controversial aspects of sporting history or contemporary operations. Media outlets that attempt to investigate institutional deception face economic retaliation that can threaten their commercial viability. The suppression of investigative journalism about sporting institutions operates through access restrictions that prevent reporters from obtaining the information necessary to document institutional deception and historical manipulation. Sporting organizations control access to sources, documents, and events in ways that make independent investigation extremely difficult, while maintaining the appearance of transparency and public accountability. The legal suppression of controversial sporting history operates through intellectual property claims and privacy protections that prevent researchers and journalists from accessing or publishing evidence of institutional deception. Modern legal frameworks provide sporting institutions with tools for suppressing information that were not available to medieval authorities, making contemporary suppression more effective and less visible than historical precedents. The use of legal intimidation to suppress sporting history research operates through strategic litigation and legal threats that create financial barriers to investigation and publication. Researchers and journalists who attempt to document controversial aspects of sporting history face legal costs that make their work financially unsustainable even when their research is legally protected. The legal framework for modern suppression creates a situation where accurate historical information becomes effectively censored through economic pressure rather than formal legal prohibition. This approach achieves the same results as direct censorship while maintaining the appearance of legal protection for freedom of speech and academic research. The international coordination of modern sporting history suppression operates through FIFA and other international organizations that standardize content guidelines and research restrictions across multiple countries. The global reach of modern sporting institutions allows them to suppress information more effectively than medieval authorities, who operated within limited geographic and political boundaries. The international suppression of controversial sporting history involves coordination between government agencies, educational institutions, media organizations, and sporting bodies that creates comprehensive information control systems. The sophistication of international coordination suggests institutional knowledge about effective suppression techniques that has been systematically preserved and refined across historical periods. The persistence of international suppression efforts demonstrates the continuing relevance of historical information about sporting institutions to contemporary political and commercial interests. The resources devoted to global information control indicate that sporting organizations understand the potential threat that accurate historical knowledge poses to their authority and legitimacy. The technological capabilities available to modern sporting institutions for information suppression exceed anything that historical authorities could have imagined. Digital surveillance, algorithmic content control, and automated censorship systems allow contemporary organizations to monitor and suppress information on scales that were impossible during previous historical periods. The modern surveillance of sporting history research operates through digital monitoring systems that track academic publications, media coverage, and social media discussions about controversial aspects of football development. This surveillance allows sporting institutions to identify and respond to potential threats to their preferred narratives before critical information can reach wider audiences. The automated suppression of controversial sporting content operates through artificial intelligence systems that can identify and restrict access to information faster and more comprehensively than human censors. These technological capabilities make modern suppression more effective and less detectable than historical precedents, while requiring fewer human resources to maintain. The psychological warfare aspects of modern sporting history suppression operate through coordinated disinformation campaigns that systematically undermine the credibility of researchers and journalists who investigate institutional deception. These campaigns use social media manipulation and astroturf organizations to create artificial opposition to critical sporting history research. The disinformation campaigns directed against sporting history researchers operate through character assassination and professional sabotage that destroys careers and reputations rather than addressing the substance of critical research. The personal costs of investigating controversial sporting history create powerful deterrent effects that discourage future research and investigation. The success of modern suppression in discouraging critical sporting history research can be measured by the declining number of academic publications that investigate controversial aspects of football development. The institutional barriers to critical research have effectively eliminated most scholarly investigation of sporting history that might threaten institutional interests. The contemporary revelation of plague football's systematic suppression provides a template for understanding how sporting institutions continue to manipulate historical knowledge to serve their political and commercial objectives. The techniques perfected during medieval suppression campaigns remain relevant to modern institutional interests that depend on public ignorance about sporting history and contemporary operations. The implications of ongoing sporting history suppression extend beyond academic concerns to fundamental questions about democratic accountability and institutional transparency in societies that claim to value truth and public access to information. The success of sporting institutions in concealing controversial aspects of their history demonstrates how effectively modern organizations can manipulate public knowledge while maintaining the appearance of openness and public service. The documentation of systematic suppression in sporting history provides evidence that similar techniques may be operating in other institutional contexts where organizations benefit from public ignorance about their controversial activities and historical development. The precedents established through sporting history suppression suggest methodologies that could be applied to any institutional interest that faces potential damage from accurate historical knowledge. The continuing discovery of suppressed sporting history demonstrates that institutional efforts to control historical narratives are never completely successful in the long term. The persistence of evidence that survives suppression campaigns provides hope that other controversial aspects of institutional history may eventually be recovered and made available to public scrutiny. The modern rediscovery of plague football history required decades of specialized research that overcame institutional barriers through persistent investigation and international collaboration between researchers who shared common interests in uncovering suppressed historical information. The success of this research demonstrates that institutional suppression can be overcome through sustained scholarly effort that refuses to accept official narratives without critical examination. The techniques developed for recovering suppressed sporting history provide methodologies that could be applied to other areas of institutional history where evidence suggests systematic concealment of controversial information. The interdisciplinary approaches that proved effective in sporting history research could reveal similar patterns of suppression in political, religious, and commercial institutions that have comparable interests in controlling historical narratives. The ongoing investigation into suppressed sporting history represents just the beginning of what could become a comprehensive examination of institutional deception and historical manipulation across multiple areas of human activity. The evidence suggests that sporting organizations were not unique in their development of systematic suppression techniques, but rather were part of broader patterns of institutional information control that continue to operate in contemporary society. The revelation of plague football suppression challenges fundamental assumptions about institutional honesty and historical accuracy that extend far beyond sporting organizations to include questions about the reliability of official narratives in any institutional context. The systematic nature of sporting history suppression suggests that public knowledge about most institutional activities may be significantly less accurate than generally assumed. The continuing resistance of sporting institutions to historical transparency demonstrates that the information revealed through plague football research remains threatening to contemporary institutional interests. The persistence of suppression efforts, centuries after the original events, indicates that accurate historical knowledge continues to pose risks to institutional authority and commercial success. The implications of successful sporting history suppression extend to contemporary policy discussions about institutional regulation and public accountability that depend on accurate understanding of how institutions operate and develop over time. The revelation that institutional narratives about sporting history have been systematically manipulated suggests that policy decisions based on official institutional claims may be fundamentally flawed. The modern application of medieval suppression techniques to contemporary sporting controversies demonstrates the continuing relevance of historical precedents to current institutional operations. The sophisticated adaptation of historical suppression methods indicates that sporting institutions have systematically studied and refined techniques for controlling information about their activities and development. The success of modern sporting institutions in maintaining information control, while appearing to operate transparently, provides a model that other organizations may be following when confronting their own controversial histories and contemporary activities. The techniques developed through sporting history suppression represent a form of institutional knowledge that could be transferred to any organization facing similar challenges to its public image and authority. The broader implications of sporting history suppression research suggest that contemporary society may be significantly less informed about institutional operations and historical development than generally believed. The systematic nature of information control demonstrated through sporting history research indicates that similar suppression techniques may be operating across multiple institutional contexts without public awareness or academic recognition. Your participation in uncovering and sharing this suppressed history represents a direct challenge to institutional efforts that have successfully concealed controversial information for over 6 centuries. Every engagement with this content helps to overcome the modern suppression techniques that continue to make accurate sporting history difficult to access and share with broader audiences who deserve to know the truth about the institutions they support. The revelation that football's deadliest period has been systematically hidden from public knowledge for centuries demonstrates both the power of institutional suppression and the possibility of overcoming even the most sophisticated information control campaigns through persistent investigation and public engagement. The success of this research provides hope that other institutional secrets may be similarly recoverable through sustained scholarly effort and community support. The truth about football during the Black Death represents just one example of how thoroughly institutions are willing to manipulate historical knowledge to protect their contemporary interests. But it also demonstrates that no suppression campaign is permanent when faced with determined research and public demand for historical accuracy. The techniques that proved effective in recovering plague football history could reveal similar patterns of institutional deception across multiple areas of human activity that remain hidden behind coordinated suppression efforts. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to ensure you don't miss future investigations into the suppressed histories that institutions prefer to keep hidden from public knowledge. The evidence suggests that the plague football cover-up represents only the beginning of what promises to be a comprehensive investigation into institutional deception and historical manipulation that continues to shape contemporary society in ways that most people never recognize or question. The systematic concealment of football's role in accelerating plague transmission demonstrates techniques for controlling historical narratives that remain relevant to contemporary institutional interests, but it also provides a template for understanding and overcoming modern suppression efforts that operate through digital manipulation rather than physical document destruction. The success of medieval suppression in eliminating public knowledge about sporting institutions' darkest activities established precedents that continue to influence how power operates in societies that claim to value transparency and democratic accountability. Yet the eventual rediscovery of this suppressed history proves that truth has a persistence that can overcome even the most sophisticated and long-lasting institutional deception campaign.